The Witcher is the base and intro to one of the most interesting series of video games that I've ever seen. It's responsible for the games that would catapult CD Projekt Red into becoming a household name. The popularity of the series would eventually lead to the incredible success of the Netflix show and the resurgence of the classic book series that the games are based on. The game itself is incredibly relevant to the history of games and the current landscape of the series as a whole, but the game itself is very flawed. It's a distinct beast, one that comes with a myriad of issues, both incredibly impressive for the time and extremely outdated by today's standards. Clunky combat, awkward performances, tons of bugs and glitches on modern hardware, and a very strange start all make the first Witcher game somewhat of a difficult task to trudge through. But beyond all that, the game begs you to see through its faults and find the pearl inside, the one hidden down beneath the muck, and be assured there is a pearl there. Even with all its faults, the game still manages to be impressive all these years later. The interesting world, the ability to interface with its story, intriguing characters, a weaving and winding tale that never fails to surprise. There's so much here to talk about, and The Witcher is a massive game in a massive series. It's actually a pretty difficult task to write a good video about The Witcher in 2023, when so many have dissected and ripped apart this giant Goliath. But this game holds a special place in my heart and is a part of a series that I genuinely adore. The Witcher actually takes a really interesting space in my experience with games. It was the first game I ever bought on Steam. I remember begging my parents to buy it for me right after I got my first laptop, one that was barely capable of playing even outdated games. I got much more than I bargained for in that exchange, and I put so many hours into it at the time that even I was shocked. With that said though, it's a game that I haven't gone back to in almost a decade, so that's what I'm going to do today. We'll be taking a look at The Witcher, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. Spoilers for The Witcher, and assorted spoilers for The Witcher books. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about The Witcher. If you aren't already aware, The Witcher was actually based on a series of Polish books written by Andrzej Sapkowski. These books had not yet reached the West at the time The Witcher was being developed, but they were already incredibly popular in Poland. Sapkowski is often considered by Polish citizens to be their Tolkien. His name is held in very high regard. The Witcher began development around 2002, but another game based on the novel series of the same name had been in the works even before that. Prior to CD Projekt Red getting their hands on the license, a company called Metropolis had already paid for the license to adapt the Witcher novels into video games. Adrian Chmielarz, the director of The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, had written Sapkowski to get the license for the game. This version of the game was actually meant to be an action-adventure title with small RPG elements. Its focus was mainly on a branching story and telling a darker tale, leaning towards the original books. Unfortunately, the project was canned though after the studio had to divert the workforce to other projects. Their publisher, Topware, was also concerned that the game would not have appeal in other markets. The project was resurrected a year or so later, but was eventually left on the shelf again. This all happened in the late 90s, but years later, another Polish studio would be interested in the series. Before we knew them as CD Projekt Red, the company was just CD Projekt. It was founded by two friends, Marcin Owinski and Michał Kaczynski. Also, apologies if I'm completely butchering every single one of these Polish names. They had met in mathematical physics class at school and bonded over the fact that they both sold pirated games. At the time, it was incredibly difficult to get games in Poland. Because of the regime at the time, most media like this wasn't sold. The two profited heavily from selling games at flea markets and eventually decided to turn their venture into a legitimate company. They ended up forming CD Projekt and specialized in localizing games into Polish, which no one was doing at the time. Their first successful venture was the game Ace Ventura, which sold in the thousands rather than the hundreds. Their very big break, though, came when they approached BioWare and Interplay to create a Polish-language version of Baldur's Gate, which they predicted would be a huge success in their market. They went all out and hired Polish voice actors for the game. They even included physical media in the game to incentivize people to buy the legitimate version rather than pirate it. The result went very well for CD Projekt, and they were brought back on to localize the sequel, Dark Alliance. This didn't go so well, though, because a few months into the project, the PC version of the game was scrapped. After this, CD Projekt decided to create a game of their own. They contacted Sapkowski, who offered up the license to the series for a flat-rate fee, and the development of The Witcher began. They ended up using a modified version of BioWare's Aurora engine to develop The Witcher. This modified engine allowed them to render custom environments in 3ds Max and then export them into the game so that they could avoid using repeated tiles for the environments. They could also paint the environments with custom textures, had a new realistic skybox, and water effects. Eventually, though, the scope of the project was too much for the team, and they ended up expanding their workforce to 100 people, and the game took 5 years to develop. They had to cut content, and the game cost them just about everything they had. But eventually, the game gained buzz when BioWare offered to put a demo of The Witcher on a stand at E3. The game was published outside of Poland by Atari. Atari Europe handled the European and Asian markets, while Atari took care of North America. The Witcher was officially released on October 26, 2007 in Europe, October 30th, 2007 in North America, and November 9th, 2007 in Australia for Windows. If you don't care about my preparation for this review, the version of the game that I played, or my plans for this series, then skip this part of the review. A few notes before we get into things. Actually, a lot of notes before we get into things. First off, these are going to be some of the largest videos I've ever made. The story of The Witcher, the world, the characters, and the systems at play are incredibly in-depth. There's just a lot to say here about everything. There's a reason almost everyone at this point has videos on these games. There's a lot of discussion to be had, so we're going to be getting into everything. To that end, I just briefly want to talk about what I did in preparation for this review. First off, I played through The Witcher Enhanced Edition for PC. The Enhanced Edition was released almost a year after the first version of the game. The Enhanced Edition added a lot in terms of fidelity, tons of new animations, additional NPC models, recoloring of generic models and monsters, but also new dialogue, which also had translation fixes, better stability, and a revamped inventory system, reduced load times, which was a massive problem with the first version of the game, bug fixes, and 2 additional scenarios created by CD Projekt Red. The Director's Cut DLC was also released, which was a free update that removed some of the censorship experienced in the North American version of the game. I also used very minimal mods for the game. There are quite a few out there that a lot would recommend when playing the game, especially when coming off the back of The Witcher 3 or even 2. There are even very popular mods to increase Geralt's run speed to make the game take far less time. I only installed one mod for the game, one that updated some textures in the game to make them more lore-friendly and just very slightly update the look of the game. This wasn't that drastic of a change, but it was something that made me enjoy the game a bit better. I tried to keep it mostly vanilla though, because I am judging the game from a retrospective point of view, and it wouldn't be fair to mod the game up and then try to talk about it from a perspective of hindsight. Now, because The Witcher has multiple outcomes, not just in ending, but in side quests, random interactions, and combat encounters, I did play through the game multiple times. I will not be going through each playthrough though, as I feel it would be counterproductive to the point that I'm about to make with this review. I will be focusing solely on the first playthrough that I made through the game, where I tried to make choices based on the way that I felt about the narrative in front of me. Because the games that follow this also take these choices that were made into account, this will be the playthrough that we'll be using for the series moving forward. This is the foundation, and these choices will be carried on as we get into The Witcher 2 and 3. I also want to note here that I will not be talking about the side scenarios quite yet. I may come back to them in the full series video, but for now, because of their nature and sort of isolated design, I'll just be focusing on the first game here. For this review, I also decided to read the entire Witcher series, something that I had been putting off for quite some time. I have played all 3 games before, as I've been a fan of the series for a while. I did try to read the books in high school, but they just never really clicked. I am a massive fan of fantasy literature as well, but I just never got around to reading The Witcher. Normally, I wouldn't finish reading books until I was finished with the entire series and wrapping up talk at the end, but I felt that it was important to read the entire series before writing the review for the first game. The reason for this is because the games technically take place after those books. They are not a direct adaptation of the books, but almost like a fan fiction, an idea of what could have happened after. I will say that having read all of the books in the series, they are easily my favorite part of this entire series. The books are really just a step above the games and even the Netflix show. They're something truly amazing, with a fantastic world, interesting characters, and odd dynamics that keep you interested. With that knowledge in mind, I will be keeping book spoilers to a minimum. At points, I will quote directly from the books to make points about the characters in the game, and I will be giving short lore lessons to set up the context for the story of The Witcher. But I will try and keep plot points and story spoilers for the books pretty low. I will be talking about the books in general when finishing this series up though, where I will very clearly warn about spoilers beforehand. I did also watch the entirety of the 3 seasons of the Netflix show for this review, which we'll also be talking about once the series is complete. Not too sure why I did that, because it wasn't really necessary. I also watched the Man with No Name trilogy to prepare for this review. For some reason, I really connected Geralt and the Wandering Cowboy and really wanted to revisit those, so it gave me a good excuse to go back and watch them. In general, I tried to experience as much of this series and the media surrounding it that I could before writing about these games. This gives a much better context for the story at hand, the game's development, and where its creators were coming from when making it. I also want to point out that through the course of this video, I will be giving brief background information where pertinent. If you've never played these games or played them and weren't too sure about who was who or what was going on, I'll be stopping at critical moments to keep you all on board with me. This game has a ton of lore and a ton of complicated politics, but my aim with this video is to make everything simple, understandable, and digestible, all while diving as deep into this series as I can. I also just once again want to justify the length of this video. I haven't made a video this in-depth in quite some time. It also hasn't taken me this long to make a video in quite some time. But when I began reading the books and replaying these games, I knew that I needed to do this series justice. There's a lot here, and the world of The Witcher is some of the best that I've experienced in fantasy. It's interesting, it has depth, it has substance, but it's also very unique. This is probably because it was written from a Polish perspective and completely different from a lot of the American fantasy that dominates the market today. With all of that being said, let's get into The Witcher. The Witcher actually begins with a cutscene, one that plays before we even get to the main menu. This cutscene is based on the short story, The Witcher. This is the first short story in The Last Wish, the first book in the Witcher chronology. This was actually the second book published in the series though, as Sword of Destiny was the first. The story was originally published in Fantastica, a Polish sci-fi magazine. It was also in Wiedźmin, the first book published in the Witcher series, technically. It's basically the same book as The Last Wish, minus one short story about Geralt's mother. The short story itself actually sees Geralt taking a job from Foltest, the king of Temeria. Turns out that Foltest had a child to his sister, Ada, but she and the mother did not make it through the birth. The child then reawoke, becoming a Striga. A Striga is a monster that usually results from a cursed woman. Not much is known about this breed of beast, as Ada is the most prominent case that were shown in the series. In the story, and in the cutscene, Geralt is tasked with saving the child from the curse. The spell can be lifted by spending an entire night with the beast. Geralt does this, though, becoming injured in the process. In the short story, people try to get him to kill the beast in exchange for a price, but Foltest is very adamant about wanting his daughter to live and be cured. This cutscene is very, very long. It's about 7 minutes in total, but it does a lot of important things. First of all, and most importantly, it shows off exactly what a Witcher can do. It gives us a good idea of how strong and powerful these people are. We can see not only their raw power, but their ability as well. As Geralt dances around the battlefield, he manages to outwit and outplay this creature. It's a really good way to introduce us to Geralt specifically, to show us the man himself at work. It is the working man who is the happy man. It is the idle man who is the miserable man. The other thing this scene does is introduce us to the wide variety of methods that Geralt uses to take down these foes, subtly but pointedly introducing us to things like potions, which empower and enhance Geralt's abilities. When the sun rises, we can begin the game. A narrator sets the tone for our adventure. It's been 5 years since the Great War, something we'll get into eventually. Plague and famine have been running rampant, and the dwarves and the elves are licking their wounds, preparing for one final battle. Beasts are more prominent than ever, and one final question sticks in people's minds. What happened to the Witchers? We begin in the Blue Mountains north of Cadwyn, at Kaer Morhen. Now, before we get too deep into this, I'd like to give a bit of a lore lesson for those of you that aren't familiar with the world of The Witcher. I just want to make a quick note that when I'm talking about lore and parts of history, I will be talking about both book and game lore. Now, most of the lore is the same in the beginning, but I will note where things differ and how they differ between the game world and the book world. But first, let's just briefly talk about what Witchers are. In this world, Witchers are a type of hunter for hire. They hunt beasts for pay. This can be anything from killing a large pest in the area to trying to cure a person inflicted with a curse. In the books, Witchers, Geralt in particular, have a very hard time making money doing this. People often don't want to pay and look down on Witchers as mutants. The Order of Witchers were actually created in the 10th century. This was an attempt by kings and mages to create a sort of knight that could also use magic. This didn't last long, and the experiment was a disappointment. They branched off to form their own Witcher schools with the goal of eradicating monsters. Witchers are actually created through a process of trials and mutations. Most do not survive these trials. Witchers are created during childhood because the process does not seem to work on adults, but a lot of children will perish during one of these stages. These trials can have some side effects specific to the individual. They can be random but are rarely foreseen. Geralt specifically had his hair turned white during his trials. The training of Witchers is very strict. They mold their bodies and minds to create the perfect killing machine, something that can perform in combat very well. They have to be able to take on massive giant beasts, after all. At the time we first see this world in-game, the Witcher school we focus on, the School of the Wolf, is located in Kaer Morhen. Kaer Morhen is a dilapidated keep, once a place where new Witchers were created, where the trials and changes would take place. It is now just a rest area for current Witchers, a place where they can stay and take some time off before heading back out on the road again in search of work. The term Witcher wasn't actually coined by Sapkowski. It was supposedly coined by Adrian Chmielarz, the creator of the cancelled Witcher game. There are conflicting reports on this because I think most attribute this coining to CD Projekt Red. Witcher isn't really a term, it's just a made-up fantasy name for these beast killers. In Polish, it was Wiedźmin, the name of the first book that Sapkowski published, but in English, a term needed to be created, and Witcher was it. This is also the name that the mages and kings gave the order because their creations were only capable of mere witchery, whereas mages were capable of things much more powerful. Witchers can't fully cast spells, they can only use signs. Signs are very simple spells that mostly have applications in combat. These simple abilities usually see Witchers using one-handed swords so that their other hand is free to wield a sign in battle. Witchers are generally not respected among the realm. Some will treat them with human decency, but a lot of people tend to think of them as a necessary evil. They are looked at as mutants. Their general disposition and their cat-like eyes tend to scare people off, but they don't think that they should be wandering the lands. Some go as far as to not even recognize the services that the Witchers offer. Witchers will go without pay for the work they've done and even be ridiculed or harassed by the people of the towns that they help. Witchers are also surrounded in myth. Many people throughout the land think that they are beings void of emotion that are captured as children, whisked away to a school to be mutated into a monster, to stalk in the night and fight other monsters. A lot of these myths are dispelled as we begin to see the culture of the Witchers and who they are and how they act. Another very large part of the Witchers' society is their neutrality, but that's something we'll return to later. At Kaer Morhen, Geralt is wandering the forests and collapses injured on the ground. Geralt of Rivia is the main character of our story and the one Witcher that the games focus on. We'll get more into his character as we progress through the video, but for now, just know that Geralt is not exactly like the other Witchers. Geralt is brought back to Kaer Morhen by Eskel and Vesemir. 2 days later, Geralt is talking to Triss, a sorceress that is a great friend to the Witchers. After Geralt wakes up, it seems that he has no memories of his past. He doesn't remember really anything other than how to fight. He recalls vague things like a brief wisp of his relationship with Triss, that she was important to him. As the two speak, crows begin to fly, and just as Vesemir asks Geralt if their new recruit Leo is ready for the path, bandits show up at Kaer Morhen's gates. Lambert holds the first wave of them off and warns the rest of their presence. The group begins to pour in, and Vesemir manages to close the gates before the bandits get in. Still, a few mercs have managed to make their way inside Kaer Morhen, and it's time to learn how to fight. Before we get more into the story, I should probably give a brief rundown of the combat of The Witcher. The Witcher isn't your average RPG. It has a very unique and admittedly very dated combat system. When we want to fight an enemy, we walk up to them and click on their character model. This will then send Geralt into an animation. Our cursor will change to a fiery yellow sword and then a fiery red sword. If we time the second click correctly, Geralt will attack again, going into the second stage of the combo and increasing his damage. This chain of attacks is limited to a certain number which can be upgraded with our skills. The regular attacks also have a chance to hit that's going on in the background of the game's engine. Sometimes we will click an attack and the enemy will dodge or block our attack, causing the animation to halt in the middle. It should also be mentioned that we have 3 different styles of attack. The first is the strong style. This was developed by Temerian Landskinecks, elite military units that could not be scared down, even by cavalry. The strong style is best used against larger armored opponents. The style is slightly slow, but deals the most damage with a single blow. The fast style was based on observations of wild cats by the elven poet Nisael. It's also been referred to as the Fiery Dancer. It favors agility over high damage. It's quick and agile rather than slow and punchy. Nisael wrote of the style that the ideal swordsman is a flame that cannot be hurt and inflicts wounds each time it is touched. The final style, the group style, was called the Nine Sun Swords. It was created by the swordsmen of the Viroledo as a way of dealing with multiple combatants at once. The group style is characterized by its swiping and arcing attacks. It's best used when dealing with multiple smaller enemies. When attacking a new enemy, the game does not tell us which style to use. It's something that we just have to figure out on our own. It's something that comes with experimentation and fighting a lot of foes over time. Using the wrong style on an enemy will either see us missing every shot we take or doing a ridiculously low amount of damage. Of course, we also have our Witcher signs, which Geralt does not remember how to perform at the beginning of the game. We accrue these over the course of the game, obtaining new ones at different intervals. There are 5 in total, and the first one that we receive is Ard. This will send a wave of psychokinetic force out in front of us, pushing enemies back, stunning them, or even knocking down weak walls. Ard can be incredibly useful, not only to slightly damage enemies and provide some space for us in combat, but it also has the chance to temporarily incapacitate an enemy. While stunned, we can go for a coup de grace, which will kill the enemy in one hit. This is incredibly useful for obvious reasons. We can even do this to pretty powerful enemies. This ends up making it one of the most powerful and useful signs in the game, and one that I used very often. Igni is a sign that will see a small pyrokinetic blast projected from the user's hand. This is probably the only other useful sign in the game, to be honest. Between Igni and Ard, we're basically fully set for any task that we need to handle. Igni is mostly based in damage, taking a good amount of health from any enemy that can catch on fire, which is most of them. We can also take certain skills that will increase damage done to enemies that are on fire. Yrden is a sign that creates a magical trap on the ground. This trap will slow down anyone that walks through it. This seems useful at first, but there's really not a time in the first game where we'll actually need to slow down enemies. If we can't handle them coming at us, then we probably just need better equipment or skills. Plus, no situation is really made better by slowing enemies down. Quen is a sign that will create a barrier around the Witcher that casts it. This will be able to defend against damage taken. This is another one that could be useful, but ends up getting pushed out by just straight defense through equipment or skills. I never really found a situation where I felt that having a shield would solve my problems or make an encounter easier. Axii is the final sign and is meant to hypnotize the target. This will calm down its target and work on someone's mind. In-game, this really just turns one creature to our side in battle. This again really has no practical use. Oftentimes we end up fighting one creature at a time. If we are fighting multiple creatures, it's not really worth the time to take control of one and then begin fighting the others. Like I said, two of the signs are very useful and can make our lives a lot easier, especially if we level them up considerably. Ard and Igni are total lifesavers, and they got me out of many tight situations. The other two signs didn't do as much. Now, this is a problem that I only think really shows its face in this game, and the other two games do the whole sign system a lot better, but obviously we'll get to those later. During combat, we'll face a lot of different enemies, but the main two types are humans and monsters. Because we have to face off against these two types, we need a specific sword for each. Our steel sword will work best against human enemies when we're fighting the mercenaries of the world or the brigands and bandits on the road, or even the enraged townsfolk of the villages that dare to cross our paths. We'll use this sword. But it isn't only powerful men that lurk in the shadows. No, things far more sinister peek their eyes from the darkness in the trees. The world of The Witcher holds monsters around every corner. These can be beasts like the Al Ghul, a biological cousin of the ghoul, but larger and far longer lost to the taste of human flesh. Bar guests roam the land of the first chapter, spectral dogs summoned by a mysterious creature called the Beast. Bruxai are powerful types of vampires that take on the appearance of women. Graveyears, drowners, wraiths, fletters, and wyverns are just some of the creatures that we'll encounter on our travels. But all of these monsters have one thing in common. We need our silver sword to deal with them. The sword itself, despite its name, is not entirely composed of the named metal. It's actually made of meteoric iron and then coated in silver and finally inscribed with specific magical runes. Silver has some sort of effect on the paranormal and monstrous. Particularly, we deal more damage when using it against these types of beings. Now, the game will let us use steel against monsters and silver against human, but just like styles, we will deal considerably less damage when using the incorrect weapon for the job. We can also evade attacks from our enemies while in combat. This can be done by double left-clicking or double tapping the movement keys. This was not something I used incredibly often in the game because The Witcher isn't a very fast-paced combat type of experience. The characters and models on screen are making fast motions, but we as the player aren't doing much. Most of fighting is time spent timing clicks with the emblems on screen to ensure that our damage output is as high as it can be. Other than that, selecting new targets once we've killed the one we're fighting is the other big time sink. We can also pause combat to be able to switch styles or assess the battlefield. Now, this feature could be useful because in a normal battle, we can encounter many different types of enemies that should be fought with many different styles. We might need to switch to the group style to take out some weaker foes, and then back to the strong style to tackle a larger enemy. I didn't actually use the active pause mode to do this, though, because I just got used to switching styles pretty quickly. Plus, I felt like it was a lot more fun to have to switch styles on the fly, rather than stopping the entire game to do so. This is something that probably comes down to preference overall. Some people like to take things slower and be more measured, and others just enjoy making decisions on the fly. These are the basics of what Geralt can do, but obviously our Witcher can be upgraded through a skill tree, just like any true RPG allows. This skill system has quite a lot to it, many different upgrades and paths to choose from. I will say that it's probably a bit bloated. In total, there are 4 categories: attributes, signs, steel sword, and silver sword. Each category has its own separate trees. The attributes category handles all of the main skill-related abilities. It contains skill trees for strength, dexterity, stamina, and intelligence. The signs category handles all of the skills related to casting these simple spells. It contains trees for Ard, Igni, Quen, Axii, and Yrden. The Steel Sword and Silver Sword categories both contain trees that strengthen and empower each of the respective swords. The trees in both categories break down to the specific styles: strong style, fast style, and group style. This makes 15 skill trees in total. The trees in the attributes category each have 18 skills with 72 skills total. The trees in the signs category each have 18 skills as well with 90 skills total. The trees in the Steel Sword and Silver Sword categories each have 14 skills with 42 skills total for each respective category. This brings the skill total of The Witcher up to a whopping 246 skills. Now, of course, a lot of these skills are copy and pasted from other categories. A large bulk of them are just straight damage increases, whether across the board or specific to one type of damage, but regardless, there's a lot of them. Now, within each of these trees are plenty of skills to get your mind going. Each skill has its own levels, and each level is color-coded to determine which type of talents can be used to buy that upgrade. We use talents to upgrade abilities. These are gained mainly through leveling up. There are a few other ways to earn talents throughout the game, but they're much more rare than the steady stream that leveling provides us with. For the first few levels, we will only receive bronze talents, and therefore will only be able to purchase the upgrades on the bronze tiers. As we get into the higher levels, we will start receiving silver talents in addition to the bronze ones, allowing us to move up to that tier, and eventually we'll get gold ones as well, facilitating the purchase of the highest ranked skills in the game. Now comes the question that everyone asks when looking at a skill tree for the first time: can I get every skill in one playthrough? The answer for The Witcher is no. Throughout the course of a regular playthrough without a ton of grinding, we'll obtain 111 bronze talents, 76 silver talents, and 23 gold talents. This means that there will be some silver and gold talents that we just won't unlock, so we have to spend these wisely, considering they are the strongest of the bunch anyways. There are a few specific talents that require mutagens to unlock, which usually sees us killing a specific beast and taking a part of them to create a potion that will allow us to purchase that upgrade. Now, to put a bit more of a magnifying glass on the skill trees overall, let's take a look at each tree as it stands. Most of the attribute trees are pretty streamlined. The strength tree mainly has skills related to that attribute. This upgrades physicality as well as vitality, giving us more health for Geralt. The base strength talents will increase our damage, parry, vitality, and resistances. Other talents in the tree will give us better regeneration, more damage, or more armor. This is very much the tree of brutish damage and strength. Its name is exactly reflective of what it does. It allows us to get hit more and do more damage, plain and simple. The dexterity tree focuses on our physical speed as well as the fast fighting style. The main attribute upgrades will increase our attack, dodge, and resistances. A lot of these talents will upgrade our attack and dodge, but there are some standout ones that do something special. Flaying will allow us to gain ingredients from monsters we've killed, but this is an ability we gain through the story. And deflect arrows will allow Geralt to shirk off the projectiles volleyed at him. This is very much the tree of getting out of the way. Dexterity skills will allow us to take less damage by making our opponents miss more, but also do more damage in the meantime. The stamina tree mainly deals in endurance and the group style. How much endurance we have governs our ability to cast signs quickly, so this tree is important for people looking to use their Ards and Ignis quite often. The main stamina talents will increase our endurance, its regeneration, and different resistances. Some skills in this tree that stand out are Heavyweight, which reduces the duration of alcohol intoxication, Mutation, which allows Geralt to consume certain raw ingredients instead of making them into potions to regain health, and other massive resistances to poison and reductions in toxicity of potions. The stamina tree is sort of a mixed tree. It helps us with signs by increasing our endurance, but also has some good health regeneration and resistance. It ends up being somewhere in the middle of all of these. The final attribute tree, Intelligence, mainly deals with signs. The Intelligence talents will increase the overall intensity of our signs and will unlock respective levels of each of the signs that we obtain. There are some incredible skills in this tree, like Herbalism, which allows us to pick plants from around the world, as long as we have them in our glossary. This will be vital in both side quests and potion making, two things we'll talk about heavily in a bit. We can also improve the yield from these plants by taking ingredient extraction. Bomb preparation will allow us to craft bombs to use in combat, and oil preparation will allow us to craft oils to coat our swords with before going into battle. The Intelligence tree is both the tree of casting magic and the tree of convenience. There are a lot of skills here that we're just going to want to take to be able to use the mechanics, but the sign intensity is something that definitely can't be ignored if you're someone that keeps going back to the spells. For the most part, the sign skill trees all upgrade the sign related to it, or change the way that it works. The Ard tree will upgrade the intensity of the sign and allow it to knock down enemies, giving us an advantage in combat. We can also choose certain skills which will increase the angle of Ard until it's a full blast in every direction around Geralt. We can upgrade it to stun opponents or disarm them of their weapons. Because the sign is so useful, a lot of these skills end up being useful as well. Igni's tree will increase its damage, the angle of the spell, and decrease the endurance spent to cast it. We can get Igni to cause pain or fear when cast at enemies. Pain and fear are two types of critical effects. I haven't talked about these yet, but I'll go over them very briefly. Each critical effect will set some sort of status on the enemy, or Geralt if we happen to be the target. Certain things like bleeding will cause our health to drain, our attack efficiency to be reduced, our chance of dodge reduced, and our susceptibility to the pain critical effect will be higher. As another example, the pain critical effect will slow our movement and attack speed, and also reduce our chance of dodge or parry. We can obviously inflict these on opponents by using many different skills throughout their respective trees. Certain signs like Igni can inflict pain, while certain sword styles can be upgraded to inflict bleeding. These can be very useful in combat, but they aren't really something you ever really have to think about. There aren't a ton of indicators outside of animations for stun or knockdown that will tell you when an enemy has a certain effect, so this is usually stuff that's happening in the background. Igni can also cause incineration, which can be useful to do some more heavy damage. By the end of the game, I was really just looking at these stat upgrades as smaller damage upgrades, rather than something I could actually see. Quen, our damage-absorbing shield, can be upgraded as well, absorbing more damage. We can also take some skills that will cause the shield to restore our vitality and sap the health from an enemy that is attacking us. But like I said before, Quen isn't really all that useful in this entry of the series, so I rarely ever threw points into this tree. Axii, the sign that allows us to hex an opponent, can be upgraded to deliver more intensity and cost less to cast. We can level up the skill to be able to cause fear and blind enemies. Yrden, the final sign, the magical trap that we can lay on the ground, can be upgraded to do more damage, cause pain, and have more charges. It can be upgraded pretty heavily to the point where I could see it being useful, but we would have to sink a lot of points into it for that to become a reality, and that just isn't worth it. The final set of skill trees are the swords. As we upgrade the base level of each sword skill, their associated attack chain will become longer. This means that we have more attacks in our chain attack, and the animations will change drastically. Geralt will begin the game off just standing and whipping around his sword, and end it by jumping around and doing flips to slash at the enemy. Most of the skill trees are the same for the most part. The strong steel style focuses on upgrading pure damage and bleeding, the fast steel style focuses on upgrading damage and pain, and the group steel style focuses on upgrading damage and precise hit. Each tree has its own preferred critical effect and allows you to upgrade the chance of that effect hitting enemies. This goes for both silver and steel swords, as they mostly have the same tree layouts. Now, there are a ton of other mechanics to this game that we haven't talked about, even ones dealing directly with combat, like potions, but these are just the basics, and we'll get into the other stuff in a bit. Back at the beginning of the game, during the siege of Kaer Morhen by the unknown bandits, we begin our first mission of the game. This stage acts as both a tutorial to the player so that we can get our bearings using all of these systems, and also as a massive and quick introduction to the world and systems of The Witcher. It introduces us to the world of Witchers, putting us behind the curtain of their secret and massive fortress, and we get to see the way that they live, two things that are very important considering it is both the title of the game and that we'll be playing a Witcher for the duration. We're also introduced to mages, monsters, and most of the wider world. The only thing we really don't see here is the politics of The Witcher, but Witchers themselves don't like to dabble in that realm too often, so it's fitting. After we defeat the encroaching enemies, we regroup with the other Witchers and Triss. Triss thinks that the intruders can't be just any ordinary bandits. They wouldn't just invade Kaer Morhen like this. As the group makes their way to the upper courtyard to check the other parts of the fortress for intruders, a large being is seen battering down the gate inside. Frighteners are very powerful beasts that dwell the desert. They are so strong, in fact, that Witchers tend to avoid them at all costs, making the fact that one showed up here a real threat. The first Frightener was created by a renegade named Dagobert Sola, who was a student of the Zerrikanian Masters of Alchemy. He also happened to oversee the trial of the grasses at Kaer Morhen. When he created the beast, he shouted, "What have I done?" and destroyed the monster. His notes were left from this incident, though, and his creation has lived on. There's a mystery mage nearby named Savola, one that Triss knows. He seems to be controlling the beast and guiding it towards the group. There's two other people of note here as well, a man with glasses named the Professor, a man wanted in Redania, Temeria, and Cadwin, joined by a powerful sorcerer. There's some strong people at the head of this raid, but their motivations are unknown for now. As they enter the upper courtyard, they close off their entrance. Triss is sent off to try and disarm Savola, and Vesemir has a plan to take out the Frightener. The beasts are vulnerable to loud sounds, so they could use the bells in the courtyard to stun it. Eskel and Lambert are sent in with Vesemir to stop the Frightener. Leo is ordered to stay behind them, seeing as he's still in training. As Geralt, we're sent up to open the gates to the upper courtyard. We battle our way forward and eventually reach our destination. We then see the Frightener attacking the other group. Triss is forced to cast a spell which crumbles one of the gates to close it off. The Professor and the Mage are hiding in the keep at this point. Triss thinks that they are here to rob the Witchers. The only thing of value they have, though, is their mutagens. The mutagens are things we can actually find in-game, the things we talked about before that will enhance our abilities. But the Witchers have mutagens of their own, ones that are very valuable because they can use them for their trials and creating potions. Vesemir first wants us to head inside and deal with the sorcerer in the keep. He gives us some potions to help us deal with the threat. Again, we'll go over potions in a bit. Before heading in, the various members of the group will give us a variety of warnings about the Professor and the crew that we're dealing with here. We make our way inside with Leo in tow. Leo is a new Witcher. He hasn't fully completed the transformations yet, so he's still in training. Vesemir took him in years ago as he was orphaned during a massive war. Leo is a young and hungry recruit. He wants to be better and he's trying. He's humble in sort of a charming kind of way. He wants to work his way up and become good.
I've heard all of Dandelion's ballads about you. Lambert tells me I'll never be as fast as a real Witcher.
Once we wipe out some bandits in the tower, we can make our way down to the lab. We overhear a conversation between the Professor and his companion. They are speaking about the Witchers. The Professor wants to prove he isn't scared and take on Geralt himself, but the mystery sorcerer cuts them off from the lab. The way out has been crumbled as well, so we need to find a way to clear the wreckage. The Ard sign would be really useful here, but Geralt doesn't remember how to cast those simple spells. Luckily, there's a circle nearby, a stone that will give us this power. We get our first sign and use it on the rubble to make our way back outside. Triss is upset that the Witchers didn't mention the circle of elements that they had in the fortress. This is what the sorcerer used to conjure the barrier, something a sorceress like her could have used to their advantage. Regardless, the groups decide to split at this point. Triss wants to head into the lab to combat the men trying to steal the powerful Witcher ingredients. Vesemir doesn't want them to be surrounded by the time they get out, so he decides to confront the Frightener and Savola outside. As Geralt, we have a choice. We can either go with Vesemir or Triss. This is the first big decision that we get to make in this game. The Witcher as a whole is very much about choice. We will be met with a variety of different decisions throughout the course of the game. Some will be big and some will be small. Some will have effects that we can immediately see, some will affect the game chapters down the line, and some will have both. This is one of the biggest things that drew me to this game, outside of the world and the characters. The world of The Witcher feels like it has permanence. You feel like you are a figure in this world, that you are not set on a predetermined path and killing monsters put there by the developers and loading into cutscenes crafted for you to watch. You feel as if you are making your own way in this world. This is incredibly important for a Witcher game because the books were heavily about Geralt's choices and his neutrality in general. We should probably talk about this before we get any further because it's a really big thing to know before we get deep into the story. In the books, a large part of the choices that Geralt makes are based on the Witcher Code. Geralt claims that the Witcher codes force him into neutrality, that he must not take sides in politics or in conflict. This is how Geralt presents himself to the world. It's the mask that he wears. But this isn't who Geralt truly is on the inside. He tries to convince others that this is exactly how he goes about his life, not taking sides and not getting involved, but just doing his job. This is exactly the opposite of what Geralt does every single time. He always gets involved. He's always drawn into conflict. He can't stand to see someone be wronged and sit idly by while they are tortured or killed. Part of this stems also from the fact that Witchers are viewed and portrayed to the public as uncaring, insensitive monsters, but at least in Geralt's case, this is far from the truth. But because of that perception, Geralt then feels as if this might even be true, that if this many people believe it, then it must be reality. In the third Witcher book, Blood of Elves, Geralt says of neutrality, "Do you understand what this neutrality is, which stirs you so? To be neutral does not mean to be indifferent or insensitive. You don't have to kill your feelings. It's enough to kill hatred within yourself." But the story of the books is partly Geralt slowly realizing what it means to be neutral, while also shirking this code that he has taken to. Over time, he becomes involved in politics, he takes sides, he helps people, and betrays others. It's just the nature of the world, and to be involved is to take a side. Geralt's supposed neutrality does enrage others, though, and makes him a target. A man that has not chosen a side is seen as someone who can be swayed either way. In the fourth book, The Time of Contempt, Vilgefortz, a powerful sorcerer, is trying to get Geralt to join his side. On this point, Geralt says, "It's incredible how much my neutrality outrages everybody, how it makes me subject to offers of pacts and agreements, offers of collaboration, lectures about the necessity to make choices and join the right side." All of this is important to know before we move forward and begin to talk about choice, because when we begin to play The Witcher and not just read it, we are given the choices, not Geralt. This ultimately results in the same situation as the books, though, because the choices are being made with emotion, feeling, and forethought. This is how Geralt makes his choices. We, as the player, are not unfeeling, insensitive, and cruel monsters. We are people, just like Geralt is a person. Historically, it's been found that in games with narrative choices, most players will automatically pick the good option. This isn't always true, of course, and this can change when a morality meter is introduced. A research paper published in 2021 observed and recorded the choices that users made while playing a game called The Great Fire. A morality meter was always present at the top of the screen. The study found that people would often ignore the morality meter when it came to decisions that were black and white, but when they were presented with more ambiguous or morally gray decisions, they would look to the meter as a guide. One participant said that, "When I was considering taking the money from Mick or Andy, I look at the meter and I feel like it reminds me no, that's not the right thing to do. It's kind of just that reminder. The thing about The Witcher is that most of the decisions are morally ambiguous, and we have no meter as a guide. There isn't a score that the game is going to rank us on, telling us how evil or nice we are, blue for the good boy side and red for the ne'er-do-wells, because this game is built around the world of the books, and those people have to make tough decisions. Geralt has to make tough decisions, ones that have impact across time. In the game, we will often make choices and see no results for quite some time, until hours or chapters later. By the time we see the impact of the decision, we're not really sure whether it was right or not. We're left with an uneasy feeling, possibly one of regret. This brings the game into the real world. A feeling of reality permeates the system because we don't just feel regret in the real world, we feel it here as well. Generally, the choices of the game will lead us down one of three paths, one of the two sides we can take in the game, or the neutral option. If you know the character of Geralt, then maybe it would make sense to always take the neutral option, but if you really know Geralt, then you'll know that he wouldn't actually take the neutral option. He would just say that's what he's going to do. This once again leaves us in a position where we are forced to make decisions by feeling, by mood, intuition. This is what I did for my playthrough, because it felt like the most honest way to play the game, the most genuine way to present the experience of playing the game. Our first choice here, do we stay with Vesemir, Geralt's teacher and mentor, to fight the Frightener off and let the Witcher's treasures be stolen and pilfered, or do we go with Triss to try and stop the thieves from taking our valuables, leaving Vesemir to handle the thing with the other Witchers? Here, I chose to go with Triss. In the wrong hands, the Witcher's equipment could be used to create disastrous situations, and this would only create more problems down the line. There are rewards for each choice made here, ones that are locked out if we don't pick that side. Siding with Vesemir gives us a red meteorite ore, which can be used to upgrade our swords once we have enough. If we go with Triss, then we can get some valuable loot for facing off against the sorcerer. At this point, Eskel and Ambert stay outside with Vesemir, and Savola breaks through into the courtyard with his Frightener. The boys head off to do battle, and we rush inside. Triss heads to the laboratory, and we have to fight off Savola with Leo. We take out his thugs and eventually focus on him. We can make pretty easy work of this fight by using Ard to stun him and rip through him with our sword. As Geralt and Leo head to the laboratory, Triss has been incapacitated by the powers of the invaders. We head downstairs to see them rifling through the equipment, looking for the mutagens. They found it, and as the sorcerer Azar Javed escapes with the mutagens, the professor is left to deal with Geralt. He's heard that Witchers can stop a bolt in midair and wants to test this out, but as Leo moves around to flank the man, he is shot, and the professor determines that this is just another myth as he escapes through the portal. Leo is dying from the bolt wound, but the decoction that he needs has already been stolen. He's gone. Geralt takes the blame for his death, but Vesemir tries to quell his guilt. He tells Geralt to take a rest before they deal with the stragglers upstairs. This is where we're introduced to the meditation system that will let us level up, mix up potions, and pass time, which will become incredibly important to side content and even moving the main story forward. When we wake back up, Vesemir has decided to abandon Kaer Morhen. Before we can do that, we have a couple tasks to complete. We have to get rid of the bandits in the fortress, and we have to bid Leo farewell. We also have to make a potion for Triss so that she can recover from the battle. Lambert gives us the recipe for this potion and tells us where to get some of the ingredients. We can find these while taking care of the lingering bandits inside the fortress. We can learn a bit more about the world and the characters while going about these tasks as well. Eskel will elaborate a bit more on the relationship between Triss and the Witchers. They never showed her the lab, and therefore she didn't know about the mutagens that they held. She respected their secrets enough to not peek inside the lab by using magic. Triss would like to use the Witcher secrets to heal people, but Eskel believes that these things don't always go to plan. He uses the story of Alfred Nabel to make this point. Nabel was an inventor that developed a new creation that would rip granite from the ground. Intended for use in mines, it was eventually posited that the invention should be used for war, to destroy castle walls. Vesemir will eventually show us how to extract ingredients from monster corpses. This helps us finally create the potion that Triss needs to recover. When we give her the tincture, she asks Geralt to stay with her a little longer. We can say yes to stay in bed with Triss, and we will get her romance card. These are super explicit cards depicting the women that Geralt sleeps with. He can rack up many of these across the course of our playthrough. Before we leave, we can learn some more about the fighting styles that the Witchers use, and we can also learn boxing from Eskel. Before we hold a funeral for Leo, Vesemir tells us about another Witcher named Berengar. He's someone that the other Witchers have lost touch with, an introvert that chose to go his own way. When burning Leo's body, the group creates a plan to split up and head off in different directions to try and find out where the bandits came from and where they went. Eskel decides to head west, Lambert heads east to Cadwyn, and Geralt is sent to Temeria, to the south, where King Foltest rules. He owes the Witcher a debt for saving his daughter, the sequence that we saw in the intro cutscene. Triss also heads off on her own, attempting to use her influences to find the bandits. She tells Geralt that she'll meet up with him in Vizima to share any more information that she's gathered. The two have a touching goodbye, and the Witcher is off on his own, riding past Ard Carrig and directly into the outskirts of Vizima. This leads us into the actual beginning of the game. It took us a while to finally get here, but let's talk about Chapter 1. As Chapter 1 begins, we see a scene of a woman and a boy traveling through the forest. The boy notices some dogs in the forest, feasting on a person. Caroline tells Alvin to run to the inn. The boy gets away, but Caroline falls and is overwhelmed by the bar guests. As soon as we arrive, Shani, an old friend of Geralt's, tells us to go help Caroline. The beasts make it inside as some adventurers decide they should save the woman. We take down the bar guests, but Caroline and the locals are killed. A larger bar guest, one that Shani calls the Beast, is then left outside the walls of the town. At this moment, Alvin begins hovering and muttering a prophecy.
The time of the sword and axe approaches. The time of the white frost and white light. The time of madness and disdain. Tedirit, the final age. The world will perish amidst ice and be reborn with a new sun. Reborn of elder blood, of hen Iker, of a planted seed. A seed that will not sprout but burst into flames.
Clearly quite foreboding. This is the ancient elven prophecy of Italin, an important piece to the overall story. Shani decides to take Alvin into her care, back to the inn so that he can rest. Geralt is seeking men who bear the sign of the Salamander, the bandits that stole from Kaer Morhen, but it seems like there might be some Witcher work here as well. Shani says there was a man bearing that mark and that the Reverend might know more, but the townsfolk have become silent. The Salamandra have been terrorizing the locals. Most recently, a boy had been whipped. Shani is a healer and plans to stay in town until she's helped the victims of the recent attacks. She plans to head into the city of Vizima afterwards to help treat the plague that's working on the place. Geralt tells Shani that the two of them will speak later. We clearly have a lot of work to do here. Not only have the Salamandra been present in this town, they've become a menace. On top of that, green ghost-like dogs are attacking the villagers. These are far from the only problems that we will solve in the outskirts of Vizima, and it looks like it's time to get to it. Before we get into the story, we should probably talk about all of the side stuff that we can get into here, because there's a lot. One of the biggest pros of The Witcher is that it gives you almost free reign over its world. I say almost because the world is split into distinct and separate areas, most of which aren't open until later chapters. I would normally consider this a negative mark for an RPG, but the shocking amount of content and things to do in each area is just wild. The outskirts of Vizima are quite small. It isn't exactly a sprawling mecca, but there are so many little side quests that we can take on, so many stories to take part in, equipment to get, herbs to gather, enemies to kill. It's a lot. Moving forward during each chapter, I'd like to first go through most of this side content. I'll briefly cover all of the things that we can do in that area, and then we can move back on to the main story. The first subject of conversation is probably the inn. Most large hub areas in The Witcher will have one we can access, and these provide a ton of usefulness. First of all, the innkeeper will let us store items here. We can use these stashes to put away items that we don't need for now. Geralt doesn't exactly have a ton of storage space on him. We can't just stack 100 short swords and then sell them at a trader. We can pay him to let us rest and meditate, but if it's the right time of the day, we might just be able to mooch off of someone else's fire for free. We can also partake in boxing here, which can be incredibly lucrative. It's not super easy to obtain currency in the world of The Witcher, which is called orens, by the way. But one of the best and easiest ways to rack up some coin is to box other people. Each inn will have boxing matches in the corner. We can usually challenge 3 of these opponents who will only accept fight offers if the price is right. If we offer them too much, they will decline and we can try again. Once we fight them and win, we get the prize money. Each time we fight these 3 opponents in the country inn here, we can make 50 orens, which is quite a lot for the beginning of the game. It eventually just becomes a part of your daily tasks to take on the fighters here so that we can make a little more money. Each ring of boxers will also have a sort of leader that we can take on. This one is usually a little bit tougher, but definitely isn't anything to worry about. They will give us special prizes for beating them and will move the boxing quest forward a step, leaving Geralt to seek out some stronger opponents in the area. Boxing itself is incredibly easy. We can attack and block, and that's about it. Most of the beginning fighters will be defeated if we just stand and repeatedly attack. We can block if they start to go into a combo, but it really isn't hard to take them out. There is a talent we can unlock to upgrade our fist fighting, but I never really needed it, so I didn't waste the points. The other activity we can partake in is dice poker. Dice poker is basically like Yahtzee with betting. We roll our dice and then get to select which dice to keep and re-roll the others, betting in between. The goal here is to have the best hand. We can get pairs, 3, 4, or 5 of a kind, straights, or a full house. The person who wins 2 out of 3 rounds gets to take the coin. It's kind of an odd game, and I had tons of varying results with it. I never really felt like luck was on my side the entire time that I played. There's a quest associated with it, and to complete it, we have to find different dice poker players across the lands and beat them. Each player has a difficulty level, and we must beat a certain number of players at the first level before moving on to the second and third, etc. It would often take me 4 or 5 tries to beat my opponents, even if they were at the first level, and I really didn't notice a difference between the lowest and highest difficulties. It really just mostly felt like Geralt was a terribly unlucky gambler, and I often suffered for it. There are better side games in the later Witcher entries, but this definitely isn't my favorite one. In the spirit of the inn that we now inhabit, we can of course get into drinking contests with the fellow patrons of the bar. Certain people will give us information that relates to quests, and others will just straight up give us items for out-drinking them. The only problem is that Geralt gets pretty tipsy from this and usually requires a rest to do basically anything afterwards. There's a man in the tavern specifically that will give us the Tome of Fear and Loathing, Volume 1, a very expensive book that details necrophages, ghouls, and graveyears. There are a ton of books in The Witcher, and while some of them only exist for the purposes of lore and background information, a lot of them will give us new journal entries. Certain journal entries on beasts are required to be able to harvest materials from them, and we always need journal entries on plants before we can pick them. Books are incredibly important, but like this one, they're also very expensive. There usually are ways to get them outside of just paying a trader for them, and these methods are very useful. Outside of the tavern, we will be able to access a notice board. Here we can take jobs from certain townsfolk who are either in need of some ingredients from monsters or want us to take out some pesky beasts for them. Each major area will have a notice board, and once we complete these little missions, we get some gold and experience. These notice boards are in the spirit of the first 2 Witcher books, the collections of short stories, mostly about Geralt taking down the wandering beasts of the land. This is also just the job of a Witcher in general, disposing of the monsters/pests that make daily living that much harder. I will say though, this game probably has the worst implementation of the notices in the series. Later entries will see each hunt for a monster become increasingly more involved, and overall they just fit in more with the world. Here, they really are just fetch quests that tell us to kill monsters that we're really already going to be killing a lot, especially if we pick apart these areas for side content. The one positive I will give this is that the notices do seem realistic. Killing bar guests for Abigail seems like the way she would get these materials, or giving Kalkstein ghoul blood for his potions. These tie into the world in a way that just seems accurate. I mean, how else would the man get these things without paying for them? Kalkstein doesn't seem like one to be running around forests with a sword, cutting down Al Ghul's and Graveyears. Kalkstein will actually become an important character later in the game, but if we don't turn in this contract now, he will tell us that he has lost the need for the ghoul blood. We can also meet a royal huntsman who will give us a couple trophy quests. These quests exist in each area as well. They will see us seeking out a more specific, larger, and stronger monster to kill and take a trophy from. We can carry these trophies back and give them to the huntsman, only one at a time, and receive our reward. The King of the Crypt quest sees us killing Osrel, an Al Ghul that inhabits the crypts, and the Monster of the Lake sees us killing Nadir, a drowned dead that wanders the area around the mill. These quests are a little bit closer to what you would want from monster hunting missions. With that being said, though, the supposedly individual and special monsters are really just sometimes slightly larger and stronger versions of their counterparts. They are often not that much harder than the regular version of the monster they're based on. Because we are hunting these beasts for the Royal Huntsman, they also don't fit into the world that well either. There are also quite a few ongoing quests that we'll pick up in the first chapter. Certain quests will start earlier in the game, but won't necessarily be completed until far later. Berengar's Secrets is a quest that will begin our search for the missing Witcher that Vesemir told us about in Kaer Morhen. Wanted will house all of our findings about the trail of the Professor, the man that killed Leo. And of course, the dice poker and boxing quests will chronicle our rise to the top of the gambling and fighting scenes. One of the first actual side quests in the outskirts, though, is She's No Early Bird. This begins when Geralt stumbles upon a woman who is being accosted by some men just outside of the country inn. We can, of course, decide how we want to respond to this situation. Of course, if we decide to help her and kill the thugs, then we can escort her home. We have to make sure that she isn't killed, though, because she can be attacked by the bar guests that pester us during our travels. She will then offer to meet back up with Geralt at the Haunted Mill at a later time. If we show up there after sunset and give her some wine, we can get her romance card and a funny cutscene that shows why the guards across the river think the place is haunted. Racists is an aptly titled quest that sees Geralt running into an old friend, Zoltan Shive. Zoltan is a dwarf that Geralt has traveled with in the books, but of course because of his amnesia, he carries no recollection of him. The dwarf is being accosted by some humans who are less than happy about his kind, and we can step in to help him. We can choose not to help him, but we won't get any experience, so it really isn't worth it. We can also gain a quest to take a package to a man named Coleman in Vizima, but since we can't enter Vizima until Chapter 2, this quest will have to wait. One of the most interesting quests in the first chapter is called Dead Hand of the Past. This begins when Geralt meets Declan Luvarden, a merchant who happens to be in the country inn. He tells us that his friend has gone missing and we need to search for him. He'll pay 200 gold for his friend's return, but if he's dead, then the gold will cover his burial. We of course find that his friend has been bested by Echinopsis, a breed of massive man-eating plants. It's worth noting that in the books, Echinops are described as monsters covered in large spines that can be shot from their body, not large plants. Either way, we can take his friend's remains to be buried underneath the Reverend's church, but while down here, we encounter the King of the Wild Hunt. This is a figure of great prominence in the story of Geralt, as well as the world of The Witcher itself. He's a doomsayer, a great and powerful spirit that will haunt our journeys and attempt to get Geralt to doubt his decisions. He's incredibly present in the events before the games, and he's a character we'll dive into quite a bit later in these videos. For now, all you need to know is that he's a bad guy, and he leads the Wild Hunt. It's implied that he was hunting Geralt at the beginning of the game. He tells us about destiny, another large theme of the games and books. Geralt determines that he will fulfill his own destiny, but the king tells us that he will be waiting. He then summons the spirit of Leo, who berates Geralt. He blames him for his death, putting the responsibility onto the White Wolf. We then have to fight Leo, taking out his spirit and finally letting Declan's friend rest. This quest is great because it's just a small peek into the character of Geralt, not only into his personality, but also his mind. These doubts exist in Geralt's own head. Sure, Geralt knows what he's doing, no one is claiming that he isn't competent, but he's never sure. One can never be sure, especially in this world where decisions are so gray and touchy. The king puts these decisions right back in Geralt's face and makes him confront them, makes him think. Leo is also a specter that will haunt Geralt. He couldn't have saved Leo, and it wasn't his fault, but that doesn't matter, because the loss of the protege still weighs heavy on his mind. He was the more experienced one. He was responsible for Leo's safety, and he feels like he failed. The quest also sets up the king as a villain, someone to be feared. It's quite foreboding, the power that this spirit exhibits. As a player, especially one who hasn't read the books, you are left to wonder who this thing is, how did he get here, and why is he chasing Geralt? A lot of questions and open ends to leave us wondering, imagining, and curious. Of course, there are also a ton of optional, minor little things that we can complete as well. We can bed more women for romance cards, encounter a traveler that remembers Geralt and gives him 100 gold, find an old woman who gives us information in exchange for money, loot the various houses of the outskirts, clear the crypt for a guard, find the Igni sign, pay a bard to play an admittedly terrible song about Geralt. The list goes on and on.
Looky yonder, a wolf dances in the wood. Bares its teeth, wags its tail, merrily jumps to and fro.
Now, why have I put such a focus on the side aspects of the game? Well, it isn't just for the sake of comprehensiveness. The side quests are good. They introduce a lot of things that will help us later. First, they introduce us to the world. They flesh out the monsters of this universe. They show that outside of the magic that can rightfully be controlled in the sphere, there are also forces with origin unknown, outside of a man's grasp, that is, without a silver sword. The world feels both like a land draped in fairy tale, in legend, in Arthurian myth, but also grounded in reality. It somehow manages to both play on the roots in these classic stories, subverting their original premises, while also keeping the spirit and the strength of them. The second thing that this side content does is introduce us to the crimes that are going on around us, specifically investigating Mikkel's crypt. We can find a woman that has taken her own life with poison. Now, this at first doesn't seem like a crime, but our later investigations of the town will reveal a much darker truth. A lot of these things won't be noticed upon a first playthrough, and hell, a lot of people will skip much of this content altogether. Not everyone completes every side quest. In this case, skipping over content doesn't always have the desired effect. The Witcher was designed with the intent that the player would see almost every piece of it. Sure, there are things that can be missed, but a lot of the side content was intended to be seen. If we miss meeting certain characters, we will meet them again later, but with no introduction, and even references to past conversations that haven't happened. Now, sure, a lot of these first encounters will happen naturally, and it would be weird to miss them, but I'm sure it has happened, and often at that. This is just poor design, but something that can be explained by the limited budget the game had. The third thing that the side content and the first chapter does is introduce us to the way that choices work in The Witcher. We've already briefly talked about the choice system, but let's get a little bit deeper into it. The choices that we make rarely have an immediate impact. They definitely do at certain points, but a lot of the decisions we make won't have payoffs for quite some time. The first example that we see of this in-game is actually our first decision back at Kaer Morhen. If we choose to go into the laboratory with Triss, then the bandits will have less time to find equipment. This means that they are less equipped and therefore their research is slower. When we arrive at the gate to Vizima in the first chapter, we will find Kalkstein there, being harassed by the Salamandra. This is because they are looking for an alchemist to get more information and supplies for their mutagen research. We will save him, of course, but the other version of this encounter is only slightly different. If we went with Vesemir during the Kaer Morhen prologue, then the bandits will have had extra time to find equipment downstairs. This means that by the time we're in the outskirts, they will have had more equipment to further their research. Kalkstein will not be on the bridge at this point because they won't be searching for him to get their alchemy up. They will still ambush Geralt though, but this time they'll have a mutated hound at their disposal. This is where the effects of that beginning choice ends, but the point here is not that the choice has sweeping implications for the rest of the story. The point is that it teaches us what choice is in The Witcher. It tells us that the small choice we made, that we thought would have been isolated to the first mission, went further. Now we realize that seemingly smaller choices can have effects later on. This is a check to the player to tell them that our actions have consequences, that we need to really think about how we want to respond as Geralt. These three things are incredibly important. Establishing this all early on sets us up for what's coming next, but this chapter has a story of its own, one that is fantastic and full of layers in its own right. I just first generally want to talk about the chapter a bit. Chapter 1 is probably one of my favorites in the game, and it's kind of hard to explain why. First of all, the Outskirts has quite an awful layout. Across the years, many have noted the fact that the Outskirts has a circular path. We start at the bottom right of this circle at the Country Inn. The bottom of this circle holds a cave we'll travel to later, and the House of Odo, a merchant that will be integral to the story. The left side of the circle contains a small village where the Reverend resides. The top of the circle has two gates that lead directly into Vizima, Herrenbrog's home by the water, and the mill. The right side of the circle contains the crypt entrance and the home of Abigail, the witch. Now, the problem with this massive circle is that it requires a lot of backtracking to be able to get anything done. If we want to talk to the Reverend leaving from the Country Inn, we have to walk all the way over there, but maybe we're then required to head back to the inn to get some items from our stash or talk to someone at the tavern. This means we have to walk all the way back the way we came, or make a large circle around the area. As many have noted before, this entire thing could be fixed with a couple or even one small path through the center of the woods. This would have the time it would take to return to some areas and just generally traverse. If you've played the game more than once, then you'll know that you can do certain things on a first loop around, and you can create efficient paths around the circuit to make things easier and take less time. But this would obviously not be the case for a first-time player. This will leave the player backtracking multiple times to complete quests over and over. This isn't great, and is definitely a downside to the whole experience, but an odd thing does happen after a while. You sort of lose the idea of efficiency or time management in your mind. You become familiar with the area, and running over it again and again causes you to shirk the concept of finishing this game quick. In that way, it prepares you for the rest of the experience. Certainly an unintended consequence. It causes you to look closer at your surroundings, notice the small details and the things that shouldn't be there. Now, of course, this doesn't excuse the poor design. A bad map is a bad map, no question about it. But the Outskirts does have a certain atmosphere. It's fitting that we start the first game in a small collection of homes outside of the big city. We aren't politicking yet, or dealing with magic. We're here on the outside of that, dealing with large problems, sure, but we're seeing them from the perspective of the average man. In this way, the tale becomes a grounded affair right from the get-go, before we get to the larger aspects, the higher fantasy at hand. Before we move on, I should probably also talk a bit more in depth about the alchemy system, because it's one of the only larger parts of gameplay that I haven't talked about yet. Alchemy is something that we can take part in while meditating and resting. When Geralt finds a spot to take a break, he can brew up some potions, oils, and bombs. To make any of these, we either need to find the recipe for it first, or we need to figure it out on our own. Combining ingredients to create something is a little tricky, because if we use the recipe, the game will not always use the most common items first. It will sometimes automatically use incredibly rare things when we have 34 Barghest skulls in our inventory. We can make a variety of different potions, ones like Cat that increase our sight in dark areas, simpler ones that increase our health regeneration, and more complex ones that might give us a talent to use for upgrades. The caveat that comes with this system is that it isn't really necessary at all. There was an effort here made to reflect the books that the game is based on. Part of being a Witcher is preparing for battle, making sure that you have everything ready before you take on a powerful foe. That wasn't really represented very well here. Sure, will it make things easier? Yes. But it doesn't really need to be easier. It's already so easy that anything else would just remove the point of playing. The alchemy system is probably much better implemented in later entries, but here it really isn't that worth it unless you're purposefully trying to max out the system or get every talent that you can. But the biggest point of the story in the Outskirts is the Beast. The Beast sort of acts as our little antagonist for this section. He's the larger of the Barghests and seems to have some sort of command over the beasts. It could also be inferred that he creates the Barghests from dead dogs. He's clearly become a big problem for the area, and this is a problem that the Reverend wants solved. The Reverend will lead us in a few different directions, and this is where we sort of have the option to be able to pursue the story in any order that we want. It's definitely not as guided as other games. We're not really sure how these all tie together at first, and it isn't as exact as checking off 3 boxes. The leads he gives us are the guard Mikkel, the merchant Odo, and Heron Brog. Mikkel will give us the quest to clear the crypts, and while down there we find a woman named Ilsa who has taken her own life with a vial of poison. If we hunt down the merchant Odo, he will tell us about some problems he's been having in his garden. Plants, specifically echinops, have begun growing and we need to take care of them. Heron Brog wants us to protect his goods down by the shoreline from the drowned dead. But there's always a deeper story to one of these, a crime that has been committed in the outskirts. Mikkel actually assaulted Ilsa, causing her to meet her end in the crypts. Odo took the life of his own brother, judging by the suit of armor, his recent drinking, and the dog howling for the dead outside. Heron Brog is actually transporting goods to the Scoia'tael, also known as squirrels. They are a non-human group, mostly made up of elves, but also some dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and half-elves. They are a massive part of the deep-seated race issues of this world. It can't be boiled down very simply, but boiled down very simply, the Scoia'tael hate the humans, and most humans hate the Scoia'tael. When Brog has us defend his goods, we find out he's dealing with the non-humans and we have a choice. We can give them the goods or we can deny them their weapons. I chose to keep the weapons, and either choice will have effects in the second chapter of the game. Through all of these meetings, we learn that things aren't initially as simple as they seem in this little town. We eventually meet Abigail, whether through the main quest or completing her contract. We find out that she has taken in the young boy, Alvin, who we met at the beginning of the chapter. Alvin is possibly a source, someone born with innate magical abilities, an incredibly important person to say the least. Abigail is being blamed for the creation of the beast. People in town, and specifically the Reverend, believe that she is the cause for their problems as of late. If we help the Reverend by lighting candles of the sacred flame in town to ward off the beasts, he will eventually give us a key to the Salamander hideout nearby. We can find that they've been stealing children from the town, and will also come across Abigail in this same cavern. This whole entire chapter comes to a head when we exit the cave and we are swarmed by the people of the town. The Reverend and the others are now ready to put Abigail to the fire, for one, being a witch, and for two, summoning the beast that has been taking people's lives. Now, of course, the first thing that we think here is that the townsfolk are wrong, that the message to the story is that the humans are the real monsters all along. And sure, that is one perspective, and the story could entirely be viewed that way. But there are many hints that we've already found that suggest there's another layer beneath that. It seems that Abigail is not completely innocent. Sure, she may not have summoned the beast herself. Maybe the beast was a natural result of the karma that was just brought upon the people of the town for the things they had done. Maybe it wasn't karma at all, but just a random force, and Abigail had nothing to do with it. Now, why is there uncertainty about this? Well, this is because of the nature of The Witcher and the world that the story takes place in. The world of The Witcher has rules that govern it, but it also doesn't have rules, and that's what makes it so special. Around 1500 years ago, an event took place called the Conjunction of Spheres. This was a cataclysmic point in history that changed all realities as they were known. Before this time, gnomes and dwarves existed alone, with the elves arriving later. The conjunction then caused realities to overlap and shift together. Creatures that were not in the continent before had now found themselves there, trapped. With this came the arrival of the humans, but also many monsters and beasts and magic. Because of this, the world of The Witcher is both in story, an overlap and melding of worlds and cultures, but also in theme and rules. The magic in the world has hard rules. It is even studied like a science. Things are understood and there's a cost for using magic, but at the same time, there are forces unknown to us and the people living in the world. We don't know where they come from or how they they happen. This leads to a lot of uncertainty in general. We can never really be sure where something comes from because this world is a mishmash of many different alternate and parallel planes of reality. Again, this reflects the story itself and the way it was created. The Witcher is a fantastic melding of politics, high fantasy, and fairy tales. This is all thrown in together to create something entirely unique. But because of this, we can never really be sure where the beast comes from, and by this point in the story, we definitely don't have definitive answers. Once we arrive at this mock trial, we almost don't feel like we're ready. We feel like there are pieces to this puzzle that are missing, and our first thought is that we lost them. Did we miss something? Is there a quest that I didn't do? The answer is right there, though. It's not that we lost the pieces, it's that the puzzle was made this way. We can't really be sure who was at fault here, who did wrong and who was right, and there really isn't a definitive answer on this, at least not in this chapter. But this is the genius of it. Ilsa bought the potion she used to take her life from Abigail, and the Econops seem like they didn't just sprout out of the ground, but were placed there as a vengeance for the crime of kinslaying. Was Abigail really the one that summoned the beast, or was the beast here to punish her and the town for the crimes that they and she took part in? Again, at this point, we can't really be sure of everything, but this is what makes this chapter so genius, that we still have to make a choice without all of the facts at hand, a choice based in emotion, a choice with missing pieces, a real choice. These types of decisions reflect the ones that we make, the real choices of day-to-day life. We are making assumptions, we are trying to get by, to try and do right by ourselves and those around us. Bringing this type of choice into a video game is incredibly difficult to do, but it just works. We feel like there can be no good outcome here. We're forced to choose the lesser evil. In my game, I decided to choose Abigail's side. I felt that even if she had summoned the beast, the townsfolk definitely weren't clean of sin, and at the end of the day, they were just throwing stones. This also comes back to the fact that we can never really be sure. Our choice then ends up coming from instinct, the facts that we have at hand, and our feelings about the characters as we have met them and had experience with them. If we choose Abigail's side, then she will help us fight the beast. This is possibly one of the most annoying fights in the game. Abigail can help us out a bit, but if she gets knocked out, then she's gone for the rest of the fight. I actually didn't know that she could get knocked out and live when I did this fight. I thought she was permanently dead, so I just kept reloading, trying to save her. Eventually, I succumbed to the idea that she was just going to be gone in my playthrough and defeated the beast, only to realize she was still alive at the end of all of this. The beast himself is a pain, mostly because of his cronies. Defeating the enemies around him and then trying not to get stun-locked is probably our best bet here. We can get a coup de grace here that will greatly speed things up, but for that, luck has to be on our side. After this, the townsfolk will then attack us for siding with the witch, and we're forced to take them down as well. Abigail can then go free. If we side with the villagers, Abigail then curses us in the name of something called the Cult of the Lion-Headed Spider. This is a cult whose worship is banned in most places. This is either a case of the state persecuting religion, though they do call themselves a cult, or a seriously nefarious and powerful organization. This part can almost be seen as Abigail showing her true colors in her last moments, taking off the mask at the final hour and revealing who she truly is, or she was innocent the entire time and she just did this at the end to get revenge. With this choice, Abigail will die and will not appear in the later portions of the game. It should also be noted here that Chapter 1 has all of this dissection and layers of depth in a vacuum. Later in Chapter 4, we can actually sort of roundabout learn that Abigail was innocent. Now, some people have used a one-off line to show that Abigail was really an innocent soul. I don't believe this means what we think it means. The line itself is so vague that it doesn't really prove anything. Does that mean that Abigail was entirely innocent of the whole ordeal, or was she just innocent enough, the more innocent one in the situation? Was she karmically innocent in the end, some sort of justice, the end justifies the means and whatnot? There's also the fact that the game is full of unreliable narrators. The Witcher purposefully gives us information that isn't true. We always have to be looking for the source because they could be swayed or could be wrong. Now, this specific line comes from the Lady of the Lake, so I wouldn't doubt it, but the point is still there. You can't trust everything you hear. This is all to say that there aren't any definitive answers, and there really shouldn't be. You're forced to consider both sides here, all sides, from all aspects. The first time you play this section and are made to make this choice, you will be woefully unprepared. This is fine, because making the uninformed decision is the realistic decision. Playing the game a second time will see you combing through the story for other approaches, for more details, but these details will only expose another side to the mystery that leaves you with more questions than answers. This is how Geralt experiences the world. He is forced to choose whatever he finds is the lesser evil, because sometimes indecision is the worst decision that you could make. With that, we reunite with Shani, and the two escape the town to head into Vizima with a pass in hand. But once they arrive, Geralt has been backstabbed by Mikkel and is taken to the jail by the city guard. Chapter 2 begins in the cells of Vizima. The professor is also in a cell next to us and is quickly let out after his bail was posted. The jailer then informs us that if any one of the inmates manages to kill the cockatrice in the sewers, they will be granted freedom. Of course, another chump in the jail decides that he's more qualified than Geralt, and we have to box him for the opportunity. Once we gain the quest, we are given the silver sword of a Witcher. Finally, we can efficiently kill monsters from here on out. Inside the sewers, we immediately are introduced to Siegfried, a character that will become incredibly important moving forward. Siegfried is a knight of the Order of the Flaming Rose. The Order's main goal, at least coming from them, is to help out the downtrodden. They were established after the war with Nilfgaard, led by Jacques de Alderberg. While corruption and crime does rise in the ranks of the Order, Siegfried is seemingly one of the good ones. If we join forces with Siegfried now, it will make gaining access into different parts of the city later in the chapter easier. It only really sort of makes things slightly easier because this allows us to access the dike outside of the city without giving a bribe. But if we don't side with Siegfried here, he will be posted up at the hospital and we will be given access to that building. It just really depends on which is more convenient, but I sided with Siegfried anyways because I kinda like him. Regardless, we have to deal with the cockatrice, which is a surprisingly simple little enemy that we just hack to death until it dies. After this, we're attacked by Salamandra and we make it out of the sewers. At this point, we are let loose upon the city, allowed to roam to our heart's content. There is an absolute ton of stuff to do in the second chapter, and while it is great in some ways, it's also terrible in others. This chapter was the one that really dragged for me and was easily the longest in the course of the tale. The first lead we're given is to head to a nearby detective to try and work with him to find anyone working with Salamandra in the city. But before we get to that, we need to obsessively complete every single piece of side content that we possibly can. Of course, the first place we can check in is the tavern. Here we can do much of the same as the country inn. We can box, we can play dice poker with some folks, we can store our stuff, we can rest, and we can drink. We, of course, can take part in many side quests, a lot of which will find their way to tie back into the main story, but let's talk about those now. The quest that we took in Chapter 1, Hot Potato, to deliver a package to Coleman, can now be completed. That is, only if we didn't allow the Scoia'tael to take the weapons from Heron Brog. If we did, then Coleman will have already been killed. If we do get the chance to meet him, we can find out that he's tied up in the whole story and the living, breathing city of Vizima. Vizima is currently racked with a drug problem. People are selling and using Fistech like nobody's business. Fistech is a drug specific to this world, and people love it. It should also be noted that we're now moving around the temple quarter of Vizima. We will gain access to the swamp later in this chapter, but won't gain access to the other area of the city until the next chapter. The temple quarter is much better to navigate than the outskirts of Vizima. There are better pathways through certain parts of the city, and we can move about slightly easier. In addition to the fact that the area is a bit smaller to travel around in general, it seems to take less time to get around as well. That being said, there are still huge flaws with the map design. The entrance to the cemetery is completely isolated down a long path on its own. The city jail and the guard post are also isolated down a long lane by themselves. Getting from one of these points to the other can take a while, and it's incredibly annoying when there could just be a short path that connects the two. The middle area of the city with the hospital seems to split up the rest of the map and force it into this giant C shape. But the advantages of the city compared to the open outskirts are astounding. We can enter a ton of different buildings, interact with a massive amount of NPCs who either have little stories, quests, or information to give us. The place just really feels alive. There's a permanence to it all. Combine this with the day and night cycle that, though tedious at times, makes things feel realistic. The swamp is a little bit more traversable, though it is much larger. We don't necessarily have the same issues with the fixed circle path in the outskirts. It's a bit more open, though it does form the same general layout, as there is a section of the center that we just can't get through. The swamp is a fantastic contrast to the Temple Quarter. It is completely ungoverned, with strange religions, powerful monsters, and tons of things for us to discover. The Temple Quarter specifically is where we start to gain access to more upgrades. We can now head to blacksmiths to upgrade our weapons. We'll even encounter some new, much better weapons out in the swamps. I never actually really focused on upgrading my weapons that much. You will be able to use a certain blacksmith later based on the faction that you side with, but it was never really necessary. There are certain swords that are just such an upgrade themselves that they will carry you through until the next one, and it won't be difficult to face the new foes and challenges in front of you. Delivering Coleman's package becomes complicated because it was confiscated when we came into the city. We can either admit this and be graced with Coleman's forgiveness, pay him for the package, or tell him to screw off. We'll get the most experience if we just admit and fess up, which is probably the best option anyways. We can take a quest from a man named Conrad in the Hairy Bear Inn, in which he will send us to a house to recover some wine. We can head to this house and kill the monsters to find the wine inside, but when we head back to Conrad, he just tells us that he doesn't have the money. The little shithead knew that this would happen and tries to get us to give him a bottle anyways, and we can sell the rest of the wine for payment. If we want to learn more about the swamps, one of the best ways of doing so is to guide Gramps through the place. He needs the sword of a great warrior that can guide him around the feral and infested lands. At each destination, he will tell us a little bit about the backstory, the Vodyanoi cult of the brickmakers in the area, a cave that has turned into a den for wild dogs, the massive tower in the center that has special runes required to open it, the shrine to Melitele, and finally about Berengar. We learn at the end that Gramps had actually met Berengar a while back, and he had taken an interest in the Druids to the northwest. The simple quest, A Restless Ghost, begins with Hildegard Zolstock, a recent widow asking us to get rid of the spirit of her dead husband. Apparently he is haunting her and spreading rumors about her around town. We can talk to the spirit at night, but he refuses to stop his slander, so we have to take him out. Zolstock will then try and cheat Geralt out of his payment after a job well done. We can find a con artist who hangs out by the sewers to start the Finders Keepers quest. He will ask us to journey into the sewer to find a crypt with a ring inside. Once we give him the ring, though, we realize that he was using us, and it wasn't his family ring, just a ring he wanted. In the swamps, we can find a man named Yaren Bolt, a dwarf who wants us to collect 5 beggar-tick blossoms. We need to deliver these to the ferryman and take the money back to Yaren. We can obviously just keep the money, which won't make Yaren happy, or we can share the money with him. We can get another quest from Yaren afterwards to clear out some Vodyanoi in the swamps that are blocking the lumberjack's way. Now, these Vodyanoi aren't exactly monsters. They are actually worshipped by a local religion. Vaska, the resident lore expert of this religion, can help us out in actually making peace with the Vodyanoi by completing a ritual. If we offer something of importance like Yaren's sword, then they will leave him alone, but we don't have to do this. We can just kill the Vodyanoi for Bolt and finish the quest. We can also take on a pretty loose side quest to find the owner of the silver sword that we're given at the beginning of the chapter. We can talk to a bunch of different people to eventually figure out that the sword belongs to Cohen, a witcher that Geralt once knew from the books, who is now deceased. We can kill some drowners for Luvarden to protect his docks, take some contracts for Al Ghul's and drown dead. We can also kill a trophy Econops in the swamps. There's quite an odd quest where we can find Gramps in the swamps, the one that we guided along earlier. It turns out Gramps is actually eating human remains. He of course wants us to leave him alone, but we have the choice to spare him or take him out. If we spare him, he offers us a recipe for a blade coating in return, but we'll get less XP. We can save some working women outside of a brothel and receive a romance card in return, or we can take cash. There are two really big quests that we haven't really talked about that both have big stakes in the story and in the world overall. The first of these is Force Recon. This quest will see us picking one of two sides in an upcoming conflict. Before this, normally we will have met Yavin in the Druid's Grove, located to the northwest in the swamps. Yavin is a member of the Scoia'tael. As we talked about before, the squirrels are a very unliked group by most people. There are not many sympathizers, especially in the city, but Yavin wants us to deliver a letter to Vivaldi in town, a dwarf that has lost control of his bank. We can do this or give the letter to the guard, earning points with Vincent Mice, or we can just deliver the letter as normal, which Vivaldi and Yavin will both appreciate. The reason I talk about Yavin is that tensions have begun to rise in the swamps. These tensions exist between the Order of the Flaming Rose, the face of the group being Siegfried, at least for us, and the Scoia'tael, the face of which is Yavin. Because of these rising tensions, the two forces are set to clash on a golem burial ground. We can side with Siegfried and help the Order take out the Scoia'tael, which doesn't completely wipe them out, but they definitely will not appreciate it, or we can side with Yavin and defend against the Order. We will have options later to be set on the Order or Scoia'tael path, but this is the beginning of the conflict. I chose to side with the Order here, again mostly because I liked Siegfried more than Yavin. The other large side quest that occurs in this chapter is a quite innocuous one at first. We can meet Shani again in Vizima, who has begun helping out with the plague at the hospital. She invites us to have a reunion of sorts at her house. She asks us to bring someone along with us and also bring something to drink. We can invite Zoltan, Siegfried, or Carmen, a working woman that lives in the slums. Obviously, Shani will be quite annoyed if we decide to invite Carmen, but less annoyed if we invite Siegfried, but the overall best option for this quest is probably Zoltan. When we get there, the party consists of our invited guest, Geralt, Shani, and our old friend, Dandelion. Dandelion is a massive character from the books. He's a bard and acts as a very common companion to Geralt in his travels. He's been with Geralt for a long time and through many of his adventures, so he has a lot of information. This is where a large problem with this game comes along, the lack of some large characters from the books. Now, this first game in the series really seemed like it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a sequel to the books or its own brand new canon. It ends up somewhere in between, and this is mainly because Yennefer and Ciri are never mentioned. If anyone in the entire game, Dandelion should be the one to bring up Yennefer or Ciri. If you aren't aware, Yennefer is a sorceress who is Geralt's on-again, off-again lover. Now, that's an incredibly simple way to describe it, and there's a lot more that goes into the backstory of these two that we don't really need to get into right now. Ciri is a child of destiny that Geralt ended up becoming responsible for. She is the central character at the heart of the conflict in the books and has a massive relationship with Geralt. Again, an incredibly simple way to explain it, but trust me, we'll get there when we talk about the other games. Neither of these characters are ever referenced in the first game, and it truly just feels strange. The game doesn't mind adapting people like Dandelion, Zoltan, Shani, or even talking about characters like Regis, but it refuses to ever talk about Yennefer or Ciri. It's just so odd, and I think this ends up being a symptom of the larger problem, that The Witcher is a bad adaptation. Now, I don't think that this means that it's a bad game, and I also think something can be a good adaptation and a bad adaptation at the same time. There's a large disconnect between something like the cutscene at the beginning of the game, where we see Geralt preparing his materials and getting ready to fight the Striga, and the actual game, where we really just end up thwacking things with our sword over and over. These types of systems had attempted implementation, but it just doesn't work out very well, like the alchemy system. Characterizations are also changed quite a bit, and this is no more true than with Geralt. If you've read the books, then you'll know that Geralt in the first game cannot be further from his book counterpart. In the books, Geralt jokes, he sometimes has a brighter disposition, and he's much more vocal. In the game, he's more brooding and silent, but this is mostly because we're playing an RPG. The onus of opinion and decision has been left to the player rather than written out on a page predetermined. There are changes to characters like Dandelion, Triss, and Shawnee. Also, the fact that the game sort of throws away the ending of the books in favor of Geralt returning with amnesia is a very weak plot point. But none of this really matters because The Witcher gets the largest character from the books right. The world. We've already talked about this briefly, and we haven't even cracked the second half of the game yet, so we haven't really seen a lot of the areas that we'll be questing through in the game, but this world is just perfect. There's something to be said about the ambiance of the city. Many have pointed out the nature of the NPCs, the fact that they have schedules and jobs and paths. This is nothing new, and we've seen it tons of times before, but for a game with a small budget, it's incredibly ambitious, and for the most part it actually just works. Walking around the temple quarter or even back in the outskirts of Vizima just really feels like we're walking around in the world of The Witcher. There are even some quotes that are ripped directly from the books. They may not be used perfectly, but when I noticed them, it was a nice touch. The quests, characters, optional objectives, systems, it all just really feels like the way to make this series a game. This is why The Witcher is both a bad adaptation and a good one at the same time. And sure, there are a ton of issues with presentation. A lot of these issues can be excused by the budget and size of the team when the game was released. Also, just the time frame and where games were at back then. But it still doesn't make it feel like we're playing the perfect game. And honestly, I think that's a part of the charm in some ways. Animations often look weird and silly, depending on which model is using them. Speaking of models, they are reused over and over in many different places. This can make it sometimes confusing when you're not sure if you've already spoken to this character before, or if they're a new person entirely. This goes for environments as well. Interiors are repeated again and again, and it becomes pretty obvious once we start to get to the 20-hour mark of the campaign. The cutscenes can be awkward, with strange movement and pace. Overall, it's pretty weak and just doesn't look great. But again, there's something here. There's that indescribable quality in the background, that soul that can't be captured by doing the correct steps. The attention to detail and construction of environments makes you realize that true passion, heart, and care went into making this game. The team cared about the end product. This isn't a rare thing for a team to care about a game, but what is rare is being able to feel that through the game. For the game to become a standing monolith, a permanent fixture and record of that care that will never go away. Undeniable proof. Permanence. The side quests in Chapter 2 serve much of a similar purpose as the previous chapter. They build the world, they expand on the characters, and they tie back into the main story for the most part. With all that being said, it's probably about time we get to the story of Chapter 2, because it somehow manages to be both some of the weakest story content in the game and some of the best. There are a couple of side quests we still haven't talked about that are technically side quests, but they're really heavily connected to the main storyline, so I might as well just lump them into the same story. The main story of Chapter 2 begins when we head to the detective's office. Alternatively, we can also just start investigating this whole thing on our own. At the detective's office, we meet Raymond Marlove, a private investigator. He trained under Codringer and Fenn, two characters that make appearances in the books. Raymond decides to work with us to determine who in the city is working with Salamandra. For this quest, we have 6 suspects. Vivaldi, the dwarf who has had his bank taken away from him, Luvarden, the merchant that we met in the first chapter of the game, Vincent, the head of the city guard in Vizima, Thaler, a fence who works in the southeast side of the district, Ramsmeet, the king of the Viziman underworld, and Kalkstein, the alchemist that we helped on the bridge in the outskirts. Each of these suspects has their own little associated quest. Completing their quests involves ticking them off the list of suspects and proving that they are not involved with Salamandra. We can find out Luvarden is innocent when we find a letter on a messenger's corpse in the swamp, when we talk to a guard, or when we talk to Jethro down in the jail. Luvarden isn't actually working with Salamandra because he's paying for their badges, ones taken from their corpses. We can find out Ramsmeat is innocent if we talk to Coleman, talk to a thug, or talk to a prisoner in the hospital during a quest. But we can really only truly find him innocent once we advance the quest a bit more, which is confusing, but I'll explain in a moment. Thaler is found innocent if we question him about the silver sword, find a mysterious man outside his house, or talk to Jethro about the silver sword. We really learn that Thaler is just a fence in the end and nothing more, sort of. Vivaldi can be cleared by talking to a random dwarf near his house, talking to Jethro, or talking to Yavin. Vivaldi is really just trying to get his bank back and wasn't in control of his money when the professor was bailed out. Vincent doesn't take much clearing because we basically gain a lot of his clues automatically or by talking to Jethro or some guards. Kalkstein is one of the ones that's a little harder to cross off the list of suspects, but the point here is that in the end, none of these men are really connected to Salamandra, and they aren't the guys we're looking for. The big twist of this quest is that while we are investigating, Raymond was actually killed by Salamandra and has been replaced by Azar Javed in disguise. We can discover this by doing a side quest for the Gravedigger that lets us gain access to the crypts. Down here we can find the real body of Raymond. We can also just easily clear 5 of the suspects from the list, and Geralt figures the whole thing out on his own. The final way comes from an autopsy in a quest called Anatomy of a Crime. The quest begins when Raymond tells us that the crown witness in the case has died and he believes him to have been murdered. We need to look at the body and find out who did it. Shani helps us with this task, but there are a lot of ways that it can go wrong. I'm not going to go super deep into the layers of ways that this can be messed up, but just know that it's deep. Basically, Javed has set us a trap here, and if we don't come to the right conclusion, we can come out thinking that Kalkstein was the one who murdered the suspect. If we make the right deductions, though, and have the proper information coming into this, we realize the truth, that Raymond is Javed. Now, if this all sounds really complicated, that's because it is. There are a ton of ways that this main quest can fumble all over itself. We can accidentally reveal the truth just by talking to people, we can unknowingly find information that makes suspects innocent, and then Geralt just decides that they're innocent. We can miss certain things that make crossing someone off the list impossible, which is okay, just a little odd. There are so many ways to go about this quest, and it truly gives you the freedom to approach it in the ways that you want. There really is no perfect way to figure the whole thing out, but because of this freedom, the game finds an easier time to get its wires crossed and deliver information through Geralt way too early. This sort of contradicts what I said earlier about the player actually being Geralt in this adaptation, because Geralt sort of takes the reins for this quest. For the most part, we're following his lead, and if we do the right things in the game, then he just figures it all out and leaves us in the dust. It's all very strange, but the story itself is interesting and compelling. Each of the suspects feel like they have depth, and like they're actual people living in this city. Of course, they also tie into the other conflicts going on. Vivaldi overlaps into the Scoia'tael conflict. Vincent has his own issues that we'll get into later, as does Thaler. Luvarden is tied into the city and the swamp and will become a part of our politicking in later chapters. Kalkstein is a massive part of the endgame for this chapter, and Ramsmeat is the head of the underground in the city, the man in the shadows. It's all just a great little detective sequence that admittedly has way too much to do, but its jankiness and fumbling makes it feel more genuine in the end. This all isn't really enough, though. It isn't our goal just to find Azar Javed. Now we need to trap him. This whole thing can go one of two ways. If we reach a certain point and we haven't figured out that Raymond is dead, then Geralt will have been fooled. The ruse will have worked. Raymond has convinced him that Ramsmeat is the leader of the Salamandra, and we kill him. We then have to lure Kalkstein to the tower in the swamp with a magic treatise. But once we arrive, the truth is revealed. If we do know that Raymond is dead, then we will fake Ramsmeat's death and convince Raymond that we're luring Kalkstein to the tower when we're actually luring him there. Before we can do either of these options, we have to seek out the 10 Sephiroth stones in places all over the Temple Quarter and the swamp. We have to place each of these in its corresponding tower, which will open the way to the structure. This all culminates in a battle with the Professor and Azar Javed in the swamps. After we defeat them in a pretty simple fight, they end up fleeing into a portal and heading off. Geralt then passes out and wakes up in Triss's house in the trade quarter. Chapter 2 as a whole is something that is so cool in concept, but just works in a really odd way. It's like when your friend tells you about a movie, but they sell it way too hard, and then you see it. They weren't exactly lying, but it just isn't fully there. There's too many ways for the thing to be broken. I will say, though, that when Chapter 2 opens up and lets you run around, it is some of the best that this game has to offer. It's so freeing to be able to run around the city and the swamps. It genuinely feels like what role-playing games should be. The actual writing of the story is also incredibly compelling, multiple layers of dissection at hand. It's so good, but so bad at the same time. Chapter 3 of The Witcher begins as Geralt wakes up in the trade quarter. The chapters start off pretty quickly because Triss begins asking Geralt questions about remembering his identity. He needs to figure out the type of person he was before he forgot everything. She refuses to tell Geralt what he was like before because she doesn't want to influence him. She wants him to recreate the person he was before, or change it if he wants. Either way, the version of Geralt that Triss remembered would be the version that she knows. Geralt from her perspective, not the real person that he truly was. Geralt's personality and identity will develop over the course of the story based on conversations with NPCs, decisions we make, and paths that we head down. This quest isn't one we really truly complete. I mean, we can finish it towards the end of the game, but there are no answers set in stone. All of the conclusions that Geralt comes to will see him arriving at a destination of uncertainty. He isn't sure where he's going, and he can't recover his memories, but he knows that it doesn't matter. The future is the only thing that matters. Triss will also tell us that she wants Geralt to go to a party. This is where the politicking of the chapter truly begins. We are in Vizima, the capital of Temeria. It just so happens that the king of Temeria, Foltest, has gone away. This is sowing discord in the city. Trouble is brewing and tensions are high. Foltest's reign is responsible for the influence and power that Temeria has gained in recent years, but that doesn't mean there aren't people in the shadows vying for power. But before we get to the high society parties, we have a new area unlocked and tons of side quests and activities to get into. When we step outside, the first thing that we realize is that we're in a new area, the Trade Quarter. The Trade Quarter is very similar to the Temple Quarter in that it represents a chunk of the city. But this time, we are surrounded by a much more high society type of feel. There isn't a section specifically for the slums here, jutting out, representing the common folk. There's a market section specifically where we can seek out vendors who sell ingredients or books. It's definitely not as large and doesn't feel like it has as much to do. This is mostly because a lot of this chapter will see us returning to previous areas like the Temple Quarter and the swamps. Thankfully, though, the Trade Quarter is one of the most traversable maps so far. It's incredibly easy to get around and makes everything much more convenient. There's also the advantage of the new portals that allow us to travel back to Kalkstein's laboratory and the swamp very quickly. The new Naracourt is our base of operations here, the inn for this chapter of the game. Again, it does offer much of the same as other chapters, though this time the upstairs is reserved for our political party. But as I said before, this is the main story of Chapter 3, and we just aren't there yet. Before that, we have to seek out every talkable NPC in this town and find out what they have to say. We of course have all of the ordinary contracts in the game, but one that made me particularly uncomfortable was the dog catcher of Vizima. This has us taking out 6 stray dogs in the city and collecting their tallow. For some reason, this was just so brutal, especially because the dogs aren't hostile. We actually have to draw our sword to fight them, and it's just rough. There's a quest called Blue Eyes that we can get from the new Naracourt. A Knight of the Order, Patrick de Wise, tells us that his sister has gone missing. He believes that she was taken by a vampire. We can find the girl working in a brothel, but she makes it pretty clear that she's happy with her job. When we tell de Wise about this, he decides that a vampire must be influencing her there, so we're sent back to check it out. After getting upstairs, Geralt meets the Queen of the Night, who leads this place. Apparently, this woman was an ex-lover to Regis, Geralt's friend in the books. She eventually tells us that the girl is here of her own free will. She wants to remain beautiful forever and stay young. She doesn't want to get married and be forced to live a boring life. I sided with the vampiresses in this case, and this sees us murdering all of the Order Knights that try to remove the girl. Dandelion can be found at the new Naracourt, and apparently he's lost his loot. He needs to put on a show at the inn, but he was caught having a fling with a man's daughter, and he left his instrument behind after being chased from their home. We can easily bribe the man to let us upstairs, and then we have to convince the girl to give the loot back. We have to fulfill her needs before she'll be won over. Dandelion then puts on a show at the new Naracourt, which is a much better performance than the bard that we heard in the first chapter. Yavin will ask us to clear out some monsters in the sewers for him. This really leads to us taking out some monsters in the elven ruins beneath the city. This inadvertently gives the Scoia'tael a path into the city via teleporter, something that will come back up later. The other side of the conflict, the Order, will give us a quest to investigate why people have been disappearing from the cemetery. When we get there, we find a ghoul, except this one can talk.
Delicious.
The ghoul's name is Vitala, and he claims that he was not actually responsible for taking people from the cemetery. It was the Scoia'tael. We can either believe him or kill him, but believing him is the much more interesting option here. We can head over to the crypts to find a unit of elves and dwarves. We can either fight them, leaving the hostages in the crypts to die, or head down to the crypts, which lets the Scoia'tael go free. I chose to let the Scoia'tael go and save the hostages, clearly the less vindictive option. Siegfried likes this option the most, and it gives us the most rewards, so it's the best one all around. These two quests sort of detail both sides of the conflict at the time, one that will come to a great head in this chapter, but it will also contextualize the two groups for the player, and most likely influence the decision we have to make. We do have our standard 2 trophy quests in this chapter, which again aren't anything special, but one of them is a wyvern and sends us to Wyvern Island. I just really briefly want to talk about this island in the swamp because I really liked its inclusion. As far as specifics, there really isn't a lot to say. It's just a small island off to the north that has a bunch of wyverns wandering around. When I first encountered the beasts, I was a bit underleveled to be fighting them, but I still managed to kill the ones that I needed. Because of its placement and because of the nature of the enemies, this island really just felt familiar to me. It felt like one of those far-off areas in older MMOs or early RPGs that would have a bunch of incredibly high-level enemies for you to fight. The wyverns do get upgraded to royal wyverns later on, and they become a bit harder. But once you become strong enough to wipe the floor with these guys, it feels incredibly satisfying. You really feel the power in the levels. To top it all off, there's a body in the center with a pretty fantastic sword that I carried for most of my playthrough. The whole place just feels like somewhere that you're not supposed to be. Again, there are some other side quests here, but because they tie so heavily into the story of the chapter, we'll talk about them as we come across them. The first thing we have to do is head to the party at the new Naracourt. Here we're introduced to a few guests of note. Velerad, the Burgomeister, Thaler, the fence from the last chapter, who is chief of security, Erkin von Blunt, a mute knight who has taken a vow of silence, Princess Ada, Foltest's daughter and the girl that Geralt saved from the curse in the intro cinematic, and Count de Witt, a knight of the Order who is a close confidant of Ada. Luvarden is here as well, the merchant we know all too well at this point. Speaking to Thaler will reveal that he's trying to keep his mouth shut at this party, which is why he brought along von Blunt. It also turns out that Thaler is actually a Temerian spy, and the whole fence thing was just an act. Von Blunt has taken a vow of silence, but we can get him to talk once we've outdrunk him. He reveals that he's actually working with Thaler, and he's supposed to be listening for things Thaler can't pay attention to. We can talk to Ada, who has taken a liking to Geralt and wants him to bring her favorite meal around. We can find out from Thaler what it is, but only after we've retrieved a mysterious letter for him. He reveals the meat she likes is called Katobalpas. Velerad, once also loosened up with some drink, will tell us that Ada likes raw meat, lingering effects from the curse of the Striga. After having Triss conjure up some of this meat, Ada will take Geralt into the other room for some fun. Luvarden then has some words for us. He tells us that his men behind the scenes need our help to pin down Salamandra. Before we can get really deep into finding the Salamandra cells, though, 2 side quests will eventually pop up. Gold Rush happens when the bank in the city, the bank Vivaldi lost control of, is being robbed. Turns out the Scoia'tael used that teleporter and access to the Elven ruins to invade the bank. At this point, we have to make a choice. We are forced to either side with the Order and take down the resistance inside the building, or choose to help the Scoia'tael and defend against the resistance. This decision is pretty large because it will affect which path we're set on for the rest of the game. It was actually a decision I wrestled with for quite a bit. I even chose the Order at first, but then changed my decision to the Scoia'tael later on. Even after the flip-flopping, I still regretted my decision. On one side, you have the easy-to-defend, downtrodden, oppressed Scoia'tael. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good resistance? But the squirrels aren't exactly devoid of any blame. Even in this situation, they're taking innocent hostages in the bank, putting people's lives at danger. But the Order is also full of corruption, and Siegfried is a good friendly face for us to have, but they aren't surely all like that. Actually, no, I was just wrong. The Order is the better choice. Regardless, I went with the Scoia'tael and regretted my decision, something that's incredibly easy to do when playing Witcher games. Either way, Siegfried or Yavin will get out no matter what, and will come back later in the final conflict. Another incredibly important side quest for this chapter is Beauty and the Beast. This quest comes from Carmen, the Lady of the Night. She wants us to find a cure for lycanthropy because her boyfriend has it. This leads us down a bunch of different dead ends to try and find a cure, but none of them really work. They all end up not working out, but this quest doesn't come to a head until we've furthered our investigation into Salamandra. At this point, there are 2 cells that Salamandra is using, one in the Temple Quarter and one in the swamps. Taking out both of these cells will give us a coded document and the key to decode it. Once the document is decoded, we need to find a guard that can let us get access into the final Salamandra cell. From the sewers, we get to a new part of town and find Salamandra having a conversation through a seeing stone with Radovid, the king of Redania. He claims that he is not funding the criminals, just talking to them. We take the strange stone and head outside, only to find a werewolf. This werewolf is actually Carmen's boyfriend, who turns out to be Vincent Mice, the captain of the guard. Now, we have the choice to kill Vincent here, meaning that we determine he is a monster, and Witchers kill monsters no matter what. But we haven't seen Vincent act out all that much, plus there still might be a cure. What are we even talking about here? Why would we ever kill Vincent? We don't kill Vincent. After the heat from this quest has died down, we can tell Carmen that one of the druids had an idea that love would cure the lycanthropy, and it does, leaving the 2 to live happily ever after. After letting Vincent go, we can find his little superhero vigilante cave downstairs, one that will look a lot different with the perspective of killing him in mind. Geralt then talks to Triss about the Seeing Stone, and it marks a point on our map. Inside this little house, we find Radovid, the king of Redania himself, is snooping around and hiding out in Temeria. He knows about Ada, the full story, and about Philippa Eilhart, a character we'll get far deeper into in the next video. The basic gist of this conversation is that there is far more going on here than we could have ever thought. This politicking isn't just localized to Vizima or even Temeria, it branches out into other powers as well. Because we're on the Scoia'tael path, when we head back to the inn, Luvarden tells us that we need to bring them in for backup. If we chose the Order path earlier, then it would be them here. We are attacked by the Salamandra at the inn, and the cured Vincent Mice helps us out here. Obviously, if we didn't cure him, then he would be in werewolf form here, and if we killed him, then he wouldn't be present. Upstairs, Luvarden is scheming, but before we can hear him, we are cornered and teleported to a cave by Triss. This is the Salamandra hideout, and a large fight ensues with the Professor and Azar Javed. Now, our choice from the bank doesn't really affect this, but a small change comes from the choice we made at the end of Chapter 2. If we were surprised by Raymond being Azar Javed, then somehow they retrieved a spellbook that lets them cast a shield on the Professor here, making the fight a bit harder. If we weren't surprised, then Triss was able to get the book, making us the one with the shield. We end up defeating the Professor either way, but he sort of makes it out, and we deflect one of his crossbow bolts, calling back to Leo's death, and fully avenging our fallen brother. R.I.P. Leo. A Kikamor then shows up and takes out the Professor for us, and we have to fight it. We don't really have to fight it, we just have to knock down some wooden pillars with our Ard sign to cave the place in on him. It's kind of hard to get this thing to work, and I had to try it a couple times just because it's so finicky. In case you were wondering, you can cave the ceiling in on yourself accidentally. We take the Professor's belongings from the belly of the Kikimor and make it outside, only to be cornered by Ada. She is sentencing Geralt to execution for finding out about her coup beforehand. Triss luckily saves us from this by teleporting Geralt out of there right before he kisses Ada. Chapter 3 in general is kind of a dud when it comes to the main story. I do think that the side quests are really well done, just like the other chapters. They are tied directly into the main tale. They might even set things up more so than the others. The werewolf cure quest involves us in the Vincent Mice ordeal long before it pops up. The bank robbery quest gives us a sort of genuine decision to make and sets up the rest of the story and how it will play out. The Order's cemetery quest even sets up the Scoia'tael's tendency to take hostages long before the robbery itself. It all just has this interweaving structure that folds in on itself, creating links almost everywhere. There are a few quests that I didn't even mention because they don't really hold a ton of weight, just fetch quests that don't really change or affect much. But everything else has bearing on what we're doing in the story, on the world, on the player, and their knowledge of the situation. This is why I say that The Witcher almost requires you to do the side content. If we don't try to cure Vincent's lycanthropy before doing the main story, then the reveal definitely doesn't hit as hard. It makes a lot more sense if we're involved beforehand. This is why Witcher's side quests are almost bordering on mandatory. The main story focuses a lot on Salamandra and meanders far too much for my liking. The beginning is interesting enough, especially with the intrigue at the party, but chasing around Salamandra cells for hours and backtracking to different places just doesn't really do it for me. This chapter opens on the other side of Geralt's teleportation. He has been transported to a place called Lakeside, or Murky Waters. The villagers are watching a strange apparition of a city. A young meddling girl talks to Geralt and gives us some good information on where we've just landed. Murky Waters is a pretty big place with 4 distinct locations. The Lakeside, where we begin, that holds a Vodyanoi priest, a small fisherman's hut, a cave with refugees holed up inside, and a crypt down the road. The town of Murky Waters proper has a small village with an inn, of course various small homes filled with interesting villagers, a set of ruins off in a field, and a broken bridge. The fields contain a tower in the center, lots of wheat, and a strange man to the north that can give us some important items. The last location of the area is the island that houses the Lady of the Lake herself, some monsters, and a strange altar. Now, the first thing I'll say about this chapter is how absolutely disconnected this whole thing feels. We are literally teleported away from Vizima for an entire chapter to deal with wedding drama, a feud between humans and Vodyanoi, and a dejected Witcher. The whole thing just really feels strange in comparison to the massive conflicts that we were just working with. It's like this little offshoot adventure or a dream or something. But summarizing the area like that would be simplifying it quite a bit. The chapter definitely isn't my favorite in the game, but boy does it create an atmosphere. You see, Murky Waters is much more drenched in fairy tale and the mystical than the rest of the chapters in the story. We go from politicking in Vizima and scheming against Salamandra in the streets to dealing with fish people and mystical beings. Now, this is something that the books do as well. If you've read the Witcher series, you'll know it isn't all mystical all the time. Geralt isn't walking around with 100 different fantasy races and taking down gods at every opportunity. The mystical is used sparsely across the stories, but when these large moments come, it's like a faucet is turned on. The supply has been delivered, and it feels like this is just the status quo now, but it's not. We have to go back to the normal world at some point. This chapter captures that spirit of the books. Now, sure, we've dealt with spirits so far, wild fantasy creatures, even the Wild Hunt, but a lot of our dealings have been with people, their conflicts, their bloody, muddy, messy lives. But this chapter focuses on the less seen parts of this world, and that's what makes it so fun to play. It feels like we've been waiting to see these things since the game started, and this is where we get it all. As with any other chapter of The Witcher, there are many pieces of side content to complete. We head to the inn, we box, we play dice, we accept contracts. Yeah, we get it. But if we head over to the refugee camp of elves, we'll find displaced Scoia'tael that are in need of supplies. They refuse to accept help, but they want us to buy bread for them in town. They pay us the money for the bread, though, because they're so prideful. The interesting part to note here is that Taruviel is in this camp, an incredibly important character from the books. The first time we see her is a part of The Last Wish. Geralt and Dandelion are on a mission to help townsfolk from a Sylvan that has been destroying their crops. It turns out the elves have been using him to spy and get information for them. The two are captured by the elves and about to be executed. Dandelion's lute was even broken in the process. An elven goddess by the name of Donna Maeb intervened, though, and prevented this from happening. Dandelion was even given a new lute, the one that we helped him save in the side quest from the last chapter. A bit funnier now knowing that Dandelion misplaced his incredibly special elven lute during a bang session. There's a very strange quest where we can help out a hermit who is having problems with the Wild Hunt. They are trying to resurrect the fallen champions of the Lady of the Lake. We have to stop them by taking out 9 of the king's specters. The reason this is so strange is that you would think this would be a bigger event. The king of the Wild Hunt just shows up in the fields, and not a huge deal is made about it to Geralt personally. It's just something we do. Very weird choice. This quest is important, though, because we need one of the items from it for a main quest later. The quest Small Problems begins when we find a local mason that is having trouble with a bridge. He was contacted by a ghost to repair the bridge, but each day his work is destroyed. He thinks it's the work of the Griggs, small little gnome-like creatures. We can talk to Abigail, who has become the town healer at this point, and has begun selling love potions to the locals. She tells us to find a cat harness that was stolen by a rival clan of Griggs. When we retrieve this and give it to the Griggs, they give Geralt a 4-leaf clover, which he gives to the mason to ward off further trouble. This is just one example of how particularly whimsical this chapter can get. It's really great and just feels like a different type of fantasy than we had before. Chapter 1 almost feels like the karmic bad fantasy, the land betraying man. Chapter 2 very much feels like the detective fantasy, snooping out a mystery in an old city. Chapter 3 feels like political fantasy, at least for the most part dealing with the relationships between people. And Chapter 4 feels like this old fairy tale fantasy, where the rules are all changed and stretched to reflect those tales. Chapter 5 is something entirely different, but we'll get there. One of the most interesting quests, mostly because it completely turns the Witcher's job on its head, is temptation. The blacksmith's wife is having an affair with a succubus, and she wants us to take care of it. She wants us to gather some materials that will ward off the succubus. When we head out, the blacksmith gives us another offer. He wants us to gather different materials that he can give to the monster mistress so that she will sleep until all of this has been blown over. He doesn't want his little affair to end, so he wants to go behind his wife's back some more. This is far from the traditional kill the monster that's bugging me type of experience. In the end, the only difference is the reward that we see. In Murky Waters, we can also find Berengar, the Witcher that we previously assumed was dead. This is such a big reveal and a massive moment for the game because it's been teasing Berengar for the entire runtime. And when we finally meet him, well, he kind of hates us.
They remind me of Witchers. Never had a choice, with them or you. The Witchers made me a mutant. The professor made me a criminal.
In all honesty, Berengar is kind of a dick. That's not entirely the truth, though. Where Geralt accepts his fate as a witcher and his appearance in the eyes of others, that of a monster, Berengar rejects this. He resents his profession and wants nothing to do with it. He was originally contracted to deal with the local feud between the humans and the Vodyanoi, something that we're going to try and handle from now on. Berengar can also help us out with an extremely powerful piece of armor, a long quest that gets us actually to recraft a legendary piece of equipment. But now that we've talked about it, why don't we dive into the main story that this chapter tells? When we arrive in town for the first time, we find that Dandelion was also teleported here to help us out. He tells us that Alvin is staying with a local woman named Alina. The reason they were all teleported here is so that they could watch Alvin and keep him away from the conflict in the city. He will be in different places based on whether we chose Triss or Shani as his guardian. Triss also sent a Dimeridium amulet for Alvin to wear. This amulet will prevent him from using magic and causing something horrible to happen. We have to convince him to wear the amulet by impressing him with stories of being a witcher and just overall trying to be a good father figure to him. This really ends up being more of a reflection of Geralt than anything, as the way that we answer the questions that Alvin asks us fills in Geralt's identity. The bigger issue for us to deal with here, though, is the conflict between the humans and the Vodyanoi. The faces of each side are Julian, a local man who wants blood for blood, and to have Geralt summon Dagon, a beast or god, something incredibly powerful, and kill it. The Vodyanoi priest tells us that he does not worship Dagon. Those are basically another faction of the Vodyanoi, and he is not responsible for the killings they have done. He wants Geralt to lure a cow to the altar and sacrifice it to also summon and kill Dagon. But there is a third option here. The Lady of the Lake wants this conflict ended as well. She wants to see both sides reconcile with each other. If we obtain a gift from both parties, something of value, then these will act as sacrifice. The Lady of the Lake will give us a ruby representing her blood, and we can use that to summon and kill Dagon. Either way, we're killing Dagon. It's kind of strange because this resolution really doesn't have much of an effect. It's all about the identity that we want to choose for Geralt. This entire quest reflects off of our character rather than really having an impact on the world at hand. There will be a decision at the end of the chapter that will have consequences outside of this, but a lot of the choices are really relegated to this chapter alone, making it feel even more disconnected. The longest and most in-depth main quest of this chapter, though, has to do with a strange love triangle, square, that's going on in Murky Waters. The girl at the beginning of the chapter explains this pretty well. Selena loves Julian, Julian loves Alina, Alina loves Adam, and Adam loves Alina, but Alina is marrying Julian for gold. So the bride is into someone else, and someone else is into the groom. To top it all off, Selena and Alina are sisters, making this even more complicated. We eventually find out that Selena has killed her sister, taking her out of the equation so that she has Julian all to herself. This has turned her into some sort of a strange spirit, a midday bride. Selena is then killed by Adam as revenge for taking his love away. She then becomes a noon wraith because she didn't accept her own death. We can talk to many people about this situation and try to find a resolution. Clearly, we can't just leave these two dead sisters wandering around here in the fields. Dandelion, Berengar, the Lady of the Lake, the Hermit in the Fields, and Abigail will all give us the same advice. Alina had a magical sort of mirror, one of Nehelinia's mirrors. There are 5 pieces of the mirror scattered about the fields. We can take these to the elven craftsman or the village blacksmith to reassemble the mirror. At this point, we can show the mirror to Alina, but this doesn't work. She still doesn't accept her fate, that she has died. We need someone that's a little more knowledgeable on legends to be able to advance this. Abigail will suggest we talk to Dandelion, Berengar can give us some more general information, the Hermit will tell us what to do, and the Lady of the Lake will tell us to have a poem written. All of this will eventually lead us back to Dandelion, who can write a ballad to sing to the sisters at the fields. Once we get this ballad going, Dandelion makes Geralt finish the lyrics for him. We have to choose the rhyming and fitting words for the verse to complete it. If we chose Dandelion for this, then Alina will immediately reconcile with her sister and move on from this place. If not, then we have to give Selena the Wreath of Immortelles, which we could pick up from the druid earlier by doing the strange King of the Wild Hunt quest. Now, this isn't the only way this can go. There are a ton more. Of course, we don't have to talk to all of these people in each step. Also, Abigail could be dead at this point if we didn't save her in Chapter 1, replacing her with a generic healer woman. We can choose Adam instead of Dandelion, and because only the dead or a poet can speak to Alina, he sacrifices himself to convince her. There's a lot of ways this can go, but in the end, it mostly turns out the same. The two women leave the place and move on into the afterlife. Another big decision will come at the end of this chapter. Berengar will approach us after we've taken out Dagon, and we have to decide whether we want to spare him or kill him. I don't really see why you would kill Berengar here, unless maybe you're really dedicated to the idea that Witchers have to love their job and can't see any reason why they would dislike the work. I suppose maybe this is because I'm approaching this story having already read the books, and someone who was fresh to the series might feel differently, especially because this game doesn't very overtly establish the fact that most Witchers are led into the profession as children, and it's unwilling. After defeating Dagon and solving all the problems in Murky Waters, we can head back to the main island. Here we meet White Rayla. She's a part of the Order and has led a group of knights here to scope out the Elven refugees. At this point, we're sort of set on the path that we chose before. If we pick the Order at the bank, then we can side with them or go neutral. If we chose the Scoia'tael, we can side with them or go neutral. At this point, I had regretted my decision to join the Scoia'tael so much that I decided to go neutral, which ended up in far more slaughter than I had planned. The Scoia'tael have begun taking refugees in town, and Alvin is a part of these. We can ask Teruviel to give Alvin back, but she refuses. So obviously, I decided to go neutral here and just slaughter everyone. Alvin disappeared anyways, bypassing the power of the amulet, proving that he is a much stronger source than originally thought. We make our escape with Dandelion, and both factions are incredibly mad at Geralt as we take a boat back to the city. I don't dislike the main story of Chapter 4, and as I said before, I think it exists in its nice little bubble. There are some problems for sure, the main problem being that it feels so disconnected from the story back in the city. We almost never hear about Salamandra or what's happening with our previous adventures. Of course, we will come back to this in Chapter 5, and the final climax will be reached. But this feels like such an odd segue in the context of the story. Of course, it has its pros, its fantastic world building. It introduces us to the other side of the wonders of this world. It isn't all doom and gloom. Some is this fantastical magic place. The whole thing is very Arthurian, and this is because some of it is just straight references to those legends. The only conflict that really persists here is the feud between the Scoia'tael and the Order. This whole thing really just comes at the end. I mean, of course, the elves are there from the beginning, but the feud really just leads us back into Chapter 5 and the events that will come to a head there. Like I said before, though, this chapter has some great parts in it, and overall it ends up a mixed bag, which is the story for this game as a whole. We finally arrived. After many words and hours of talking, we've reached the conclusion of this story, but don't expect it to be short. We arrive back in Vizima at the docks. I should note here that who appears in this chapter, what role they provide, their fate, and their disposition towards you will be entirely dependent on the choices that we made earlier in the game. Because of the choice that I made earlier, I ended up on the neutral path, so for the sake of brevity, I will be talking about my version of events and describing the finality to my playthrough. Now, this doesn't mean I won't point out large changes as we come to them, but I won't be pointing out every single difference as we come across them. Geralt cannot make it back into the Temple Quarter from the docks and is forced to head through Old Vizima, a place mostly left to the wayside after the royal seat was relocated. We have to guide some nurses here to Shawnee's hospital, and because we are neutral, we are attacked by both sides of the conflict. The Scoia'tael at this point are in open conflict in the streets with the Order, but we are quickly introduced to a new character, Jacques de Aldersberg, the Grand Master of the Order of the Flaming Rose. Because we're neutral, we then escort Shani through the alleys and make our way out to the swamps, where Jacques confronts us and sets himself up as the villain of this chapter. Actually, rather the villain of the entire game, introduced right before the finale. I know this seems like a terrible decision right now, but we'll just leave it because we're going to be talking about it quite a lot during the epilogue. For now, the swamp is open and we have access to Old Vizima. There really isn't a ton to say about secondary content in this chapter though. There is no inn operating here in Old Vizima, so for the first time in this video, I can confidently say there is no boxing to be done here. There are tons of contracts available though if we would like to take them. These are the standard fare that we've seen in past chapters of the game, but with much stronger enemies of course. The main side quest for this chapter is the quest to reassemble the Raven armor that we sort of started in the last chapter. This armor is a pretty decent upgrade, or at least was for me at my point in the game. It also just looks sick and is kind of a fun little last adventure to be able to go on before we reach the point of no return. Kalkstein is monumental in helping us put this together. I think the small amount of side content though is obviously purposeful. There's not a lot of reason for us to be running off and doing favors for people when the city is burning. There are things to be done and a lot of those tasks require a Witcher. Geralt is instrumental to the final conflict in many ways. He can't be collecting teeth for a dentist. Oh wait. There is a large amount of satisfaction in seeing the final battle, though. The massive conflict has finally come to a head. The conflict that we've followed throughout the entire game, from the rising tensions in the swamp to the full split at the Gold Bank and the hostilities in murky waters. Now there is full-on war, and others are using that shadow to make their moves. We do eventually reunite with everyone in the chapel, and it's nice to see the returning characters here, faces that we have become incredibly familiar with. Foltest has now tasked us with curing Ada. The curse that was placed on his daughter has now come back, and we need to cure her. When we get there, it isn't so simple. We can cure her by riding out the curse through the night. This requires us to wait a few minutes while the Striga tries to take us out. This is pretty unsatisfying as a whole, but we can also choose to kill her if we want to put an end to all of this. Clearly, this is the lesser option, as Geralt already chose to save her once in the past. Full circle. I chose to save Ada in the end, which will have its consequences coming up. We end up meeting DeWet at the entrance to some ruins where Salamandra is making their final stand. He reveals that he was the one who had made Ada's curse return. We take him out and have to make our way to face Azar Javed and his new mutant version of White Rayla. Now, it was revealed earlier in the chapter that Salamandra's mutant creations have been complete. They have fully realized their mutations research and are unleashing them out onto the population, something we obviously must stop. There are clearly some parallels here to the Witchers. The mutants were even made using the same equipment that the Witchers use. They are obviously used for a more nefarious purpose, though, one that we can't let stand. It's still interesting, though, to see something that Geralt considers a monster created using similar research and equipment. This sets up and realizes that question that we'll be asking ourselves at the end of the game. The Salamandra final base is actually a pretty great environment. It's a lot of new, unique places, and it's a nice refresh from the old environments that we see repeated quite a lot throughout the game. Sure, they are very similar to the other environments that we saw, but they are distinct in many ways, which makes this final area feel very fresh in the end. We fight through hordes of enemies and multiple bosses to finally confront Azar Javed. Here, Berengar will return if we spared him earlier to help with the final fight. Javed was pretty simple to take down, but Berengar is killed during the battle. We then are faced with the full realization that Jacques is the actual final villain that has been behind everything all along. He has corrupted the Order of the Flaming Rose, and they are the ones that have been behind Salamandra, the culprit that we didn't even know about. Now, this is really sort of the end to Chapter 5. After this, we will head back to Vizima and have our final confrontation with the real villain. But before we talk about the end, the big twist, and the massive recontextualization of the story, I want to talk about this ending. Now, without the context of the final twist, this reveal that the Order is behind Salamandra really puts things into context. We've had a choice of 3 paths throughout the game. The Scoia'tael, who take hostages and put innocent lives in danger to further their cause. The very, very radical extremists. The Order, a corrupt organization with a friendly face for us to hang out with. Or the neutral option, the no option. Throughout the game, it seems like going with the Order is just the option we should pick every time, but with this new reveal and the inherent demonization of the Order, the corruption that spreads only from the root out, it seems there really is no good option. This changes the neutral option to make it way more worthy of looking at as a choice. This makes us ask the question, is not getting involved really the lesser evil? It was one of the only times in the game where I had really understood why Geralt had wanted to stay out of politics. It made sense to me now, even when I had made the neutral choice back in Chapter 4, it was only because I didn't want to side with the Scoia'tael. I would have taken the side of the Order if I could have, but I had made a bad decision in Chapter 3 and I wasn't allowed now. This was the first time that I had to consider if being neutral was really what was best, at least for preventing things from escalating. Because this is a video game, we can confidently say that no, this is not the best option, because we know that more people will die if we're neutral, because we know that nothing will really change in the end. But it still makes us think about the implications of our choices. This really balances out the world in the end and makes the world make sense, or rather, make no sense at all. In the end, Chapter 5 on its own isn't great. I think the beginning is okay, and it's really satisfying bringing the full conflict to a head. I think even bringing the Striga curse back to have Geralt once again be forced to make the same decision that he made in the story is good, because it really forces us to make the decision that he already made. Now we are looking at a direct parallel to the books, and we have to see if we would align with Geralt or not.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
The final sequence to take down Salamandra is great as well, but the reveal of Jock as the final villain doesn't really make any sense until we contend with the epilogue. The final part of this video, and the game as a whole, concerns our arrival back in Vizima. We reach the city and realize that Foltest and Radovid have forged an alliance. With Ada having been cured of her curse, obviously only if we made that decision, she is now set to wed the king and bolster a new era of prosperity and peace for these two realms, they hope. Radovid has pledged his forces to help resolve the conflict between the Scoia'tael and the Order. This sequence will be wildly different depending on which path we went down earlier. On the neutral path, we can actually choose to spare or kill both Siegfried and Yevon. I spared Siegfried and meant to take the higher road by sparing Yevon, but I accidentally killed him during a battle, and I just figured fate had determined that he shouldn't live any longer. We also go on a sort of after-game journey through Vizima, taking out the massive mutant creatures that Aldersberg has set upon the city, and seeing some old faces from our journeys through the game. There's almost no reason that all of these people should be here at once, but it isn't exactly the worst way that you could convey this information. The whole game comes to a close, though, as we arrive at the headquarters of the Flaming Rose, and have our face-to-face with Jacques. He explains his reasoning, his motivation for doing what he has done. For a long time, he was cursed with the gift of prophecy. He foresaw the coming of the White Frost, the same thing that Ithlinne's prophecy foretold. Ithlinne was a legendary healer and told of the Wolf's Blizzard, the White Frost coming to cool the world that would then be reborn with the new sun. Verily I say unto you, the era of the sword and axe is nigh, the era of the wolf's blizzard. The time of the white chill and the white light is nigh, the time of madness and the time of contempt. Ted Diarad, the time of end. The world will die amidst frost and be reborn with the new sun. It will be reborn of elder blood, of hen Icaire, of the seed that has been sown, a seed which will not sprout but burst into flame. This prophecy is all over the game. We can find books that state it everywhere, and we can read them. It's been foreshadowed the whole time. This is why Jacques has done all of this, to protect his people from the end times. He has created the mutants to take the believers south and help them through the White Frost. A genuine reason to start a crusade if he believes that this prophecy will come true, but surely there are better ways to go about it. This isn't the entire story, though. Jacques takes Geralt into a vision of the world to come, the White Frost. We are left to contend with what humans have become, monsters that have evolved to survive the persistent cold. We are then forced to confront the people that we've met throughout the course of the game, the different individuals whose lives we have affected. They now affect us. This all ends in a final confrontation with Jacques himself. We battle him to the death, taking his life. The King of the Wild Hunt arrives and wants to claim his soul. He asks Geralt if he's fulfilled his destiny. Geralt thinks this relates to Salamandra, but the king tells Geralt that his destiny is much more than this mere squabble, this little conflict. His path forward still remains unknown. He berates Geralt for the choices that he made, for the violence that he caused, the destruction of the city, the dissolution and death that the Scoia'tael and the Order have faced. Because of this, Geralt is the king's greatest champion. He has wrought death upon the land for the king. The choice of standing up for Jacques' soul doesn't really matter in the end, but we can fight the king if we'd like. Afterwards, we are transported back to Vizima. Jacques is dead in the real world, and Dandelion is standing nearby. The two discuss Jacques and the peculiar nature of the man and where he came from, but he's dead, so they'll never have any answers to the threat that he was, except we have answers. If you've been paying attention by the time you reach this point in the game, you probably will already know what's going on. The conversations with Jacques, the Dimeridium amulet on his body, and Alvin's disappearance at the end of Chapter 4 all lead us to the big twist that the game seemingly leaves on the table for you to pick up. Jacques was Alvin. To explain this a little further, Alvin is a source, a person born with innate magical abilities, incredibly powerful and, as a child, normally unable to control their powers. This all makes sense even further when we think about Alvin speaking of Ithlinne's prophecy, the same prophecy he quoted when we met him for the very first time. Now, why is this such a big moment for the game and for the series? Well, first of all, it completely explains and gets rid of the complaints that we had in the last chapter. Jacques wasn't just some random villain that was introduced right at the end of the story. He was Alvin, a character that had been there through the entire story. We were directly involved in setting up the villain, creating him, shaping him. It's also just kind of ballsy to convince your player that you made such a deliberately terrible choice right at the end of the game, making them wait for the final twist before it makes sense, only to not overtly tell them at the end, but let them figure it out on their own. They do make it pretty obvious, but CD Projekt Red definitely doesn't come out and say it explicitly. But this twist also completely ties up everything thematically. The easiest way to go with a story like this, especially one involving so many monsters, is just to say that humans are the real monsters in the end. But The Witcher never really does that. Elves, if anything, are the real monsters in the end. If you want to just say that people are the real monsters in the end, even that isn't true. It's not nearly as simple as that. The easiest route to go would just also be to demonize the people around Geralt, forcing them to call him a monster, to look down on him in disgust, to portray Witchers as these morally high saviors that are persecuted and underappreciated. The story doesn't even really do this. I mean, it sort of does in passing, but it doesn't become a main theme of the tale. We even meet many monsters throughout the story, people who do terrible things, the least of which are dragons or something who are just chilling, trying to live, which is probably why Witchers don't hunt them. During this end sequence, humans are literally turned into monsters, becoming a monster to survive what the world around them has become, a justifiable reason that some use to explain their deeds. We are then confronted with the people that we have judged throughout the tale. They then begin to judge us. What have we been doing when making decisions throughout this story? We've been deciding the fates of people based on the fact that we are stronger than them, that we may have a moral and physical right to decide what end they meet. Is this how they've seen us the entire time? Some sort of monster that wreaks havoc on their lives in the name of doing good? In the end, is the Witcher the real monster of this story? Probably not. But this ending sequence sure makes us think about it. This is how Geralt has been made to feel as a character the entire time that we've known him. Making a player feel this same thing is incredibly difficult, but with the White Frost sequence, the game manages to do so very well. But the final monster, the real monster of the story, is one that we've created. Alvin was a child we met in the outskirts, cursed with the gift of unthinkable power, power so enormous that he needs to be protected and guided in his life. A terrible fate and burden for a kid, someone that just dreams of being a knight or a witcher one day. During my time with him, I'll admit, I became a bit annoyed with the child. This is natural in a video game and has almost become programmed into us at this point, because for so long, kids in games could be particularly annoying. Alvin follows us around, asking us questions about how to be a witcher. He's the reason that Triss forces us to go on this quest in Chapter 3 to prove that we can be a good father to him. It feels like we should be dealing with bigger things, but in the context of a source, Alvin is the biggest possible thing we could be dealing with. But it truly doesn't matter how you felt about Alvin while the story progresses, because the fated decisions always turn out the same. He is traumatized, kidnapped, thrown around from person to person. He has become a weapon, and the only reason people care about him is because of his power. The questions that he asked us in Chapter 4 do not just reflect Geralt's character, but it sure was easy to look at it like that while it was happening. We looked at the child as if the only reason he existed was to further our journey. But it turns out all of these events caused him to break. It caused him to realize that the White Frost was coming, and he needed to do something about it. Through our journeys, we are trying to save people, trying to do our best to stay out of conflict and not harm anyone, but we inadvertently create a monster. The monster is created, he tries to stop the creation of more monsters, and creates one himself. One we can only take down on our own. The lesser evil, the monster, neutrality, destiny, fate. The Witcher masterfully weaves a tale that somehow manages to force the player to contend with all of these ideas at once, but somehow we never feel bogged down. The Witcher is actually a fun experience, a game that I really enjoy playing and one that I will be returning to again and again to see if there's anything that I missed. The game is filled with small details that contextualize the world and the characters in it. There's a massive amount of things that I didn't even get to in this video. Certain things I omitted on purpose because I didn't think they were worth talking about, especially when this video is already as long as it is. Some things I'm sure I just straight up missed. This game is just so packed full of information that you can never be sure that you included every single thing that happened. But that should show you the beauty of this game. That now, even as listening to me talk about it for multiple hours, it's something that you must still play. I know we all love The Witcher 3, and it's a great game, don't get me wrong, but The Witcher 1 is wildly underrated. It does so much of what it set out to do originally that I can't imagine the series without it. Sure, the game does a lot wrong. The combat feels awkward and takes some getting used to. Some of the story beats don't hit very well, and the game can drag at points. Not to mention the numerous issues with bugs, graphics, presentation, and just general jankiness. There are a lot of problems, but the game doesn't feel like anything you have to suffer through. It's something I never wanted to stop playing. It does a fantastic job at representing the world and characters of The Witcher, and somehow made mostly a gross and grimy place that I didn't really ever want to leave. It was amazing. The atmosphere is fantastic, the world is beautiful. While I view the Witcher games as less of a trilogy and more of 3 different interpretations of the same world, I think the world that the first game presents is something you can't just let slip by. The Witcher was met with positive reviews. Critics praised the narrative as something that leveled it beyond just cutting your way through enemies. The game stands at an 81 on Metacritic. It's not clear exactly how well the game sold on release, though it is clear that the game sold well enough to warrant a sequel. But as always, we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Hey Dad, I just want to quickly thank everyone that supports me on Patreon. Subscribing over there really helps me out, and most everyone on there has consistently been there for a while now, so thank you very much. I also just wanted to apologize for the incredibly lengthy production time on this video. It took way longer than I expected. I hadn't actually played the first game in the series for years, and I guess it just slipped my mind on how deep and actually layered the game was. I've also been working on some other projects as well, some things that you'll see coming soon, which I'm really excited about. In short though, I wanted to take a longer time on this video to really do this game justice because, frankly, I love it. I want to do the entire series justice, so I will be taking my time on each entry, though hopefully not as much time as this video. I promise I won't pull a Joseph Anderson. These things will be out in a timely manner. And after the series, I have a pretty long-awaited one planned as well, so stay tuned for that. Thanks as always for commenting, liking, and subscribing to the channel. It really means a lot to me. Bye, Dad.